There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being dismissed by everyone who was supposed to love you. Not the dramatic kind, not the shouting and slamming doors, but the quiet version. The slow erosion. The way people stop looking at you when they talk. The way your own family starts treating you like furniture, something that occupies space but doesn't really matter anymore. Marlene Sutter knew that exhaustion the way some women knew their children's faces. Intimately, permanently, etched into the lines around her eyes, and the way she held her shoulders, slightly hunched, as if bracing for the next blow that never came as a fist, but always landed just the same. She was 47 years old, standing in a lawyer's office in Ridgewater, Montana, population 4,200, and the man behind the mahogany desk was telling her she'd inherited a mountain. Not the whole mountain, just the side of one. 140 acres of steep, rocky terrain on the northwest face of Barker Ridge, elevation 7,800 feet at its peak, accessible only by a dirt logging road that hadn't been maintained since the Clinton administration. No structures, no utilities, no water rights confirmed. No timber value remaining after the previous owner had clear-cut the merchantable pine in 1987 and left the stumps to rot like broken teeth in a hillside that nobody wanted. The lawyer's name was Gerald Pratchett. He was 72, bald, kind in the way that small-town professionals learned to be kind when delivering news that fell somewhere between irrelevant and insulting. He adjusted his reading glasses and consulted the will one more time, as if hoping the words might have rearranged themselves into something more generous. Your father, Walter Calloway, designated this parcel as your sole inheritance. The remainder of his estate, the house in Billings, the savings account, and the commercial property on 4th Street, those go to your brother, Mitchell. Marlene didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching at her father's decision somewhere around the age of 15, when he'd told her that girls didn't need college the same way boys did, that Mitchell would carry the family name, and she'd carry someone else's eventually. Walter Calloway had been a man of absolute convictions and selective generosity, and Marlene had spent her entire life on the wrong side of both. What's it worth? Pratchett removed his glasses, let them hang on their chain. The assessed value for tax purposes is $4,200, roughly $30 an acre. The county's been trying to auction it for back taxes for 6 years, but nobody's bid. Your father purchased it in 1979 for $12,000. At the time, he believed there was mineral potential, gold deposits, possibly copper. But the geological surveys came back negative, and he never developed it. It's been sitting untouched for over 40 years. So I inherited a worthless hillside. Pratchett's expression suggested he'd been preparing for this moment and still didn't have an adequate response. Technically, you inherited 140 acres of Montana real estate. The value is subjective. Subjective. Marlene almost laughed. Mitchell gets a house, a savings account, and a commercial building. I get a hillside that the county can't even give away for back taxes. That about right? The will was very specific. Pratchett's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd witnessed uglier family disputes and survived by refusing to take sides. Your father included a personal note. Would you like me to read it? Marlene considered saying no. Considered standing up, walking out, driving back to the apartment in Helena where her 2 daughters were waiting, where rent was 3 months behind, and the car needed a transmission repair she couldn't afford. Where the divorce papers from Kevin sat in a kitchen drawer, still warm from the fight that had finally ended a marriage held together by nothing more than mutual exhaustion and a shared address. But curiosity won. It always did with Marlene. The same trait that had gotten her in trouble as a child, asking questions her father didn't want to answer, seeing patterns her family preferred to ignore. She nodded. Pratchett unfolded a separate sheet of paper, handwritten, Walter Calloway's cramped script unmistakable even after decades. He read aloud. Marlene, I'm giving you the hill because it's what you deserve. You always thought you were smarter than everyone else, always looking down your nose at how I did things. Fine. Here's your chance to prove it. Make something of nothing. That's what smart people do, isn't it? If you can't, then maybe you'll finally understand that your old man knew a few things you didn't. Either way, the hill is yours. Do what you want with it. I won't be around to care. Dad. The words settled in the office like ash after a fire. Pratchett folded the letter and slid it across the desk without comment. Some things didn't require professional observation. Marlene took the letter, folded it smaller, tucked it into her jacket pocket next to the gas station receipt from the drive over and a crumpled $5 bill that represented the majority of her liquid assets. Her father had been dead for 11 days. She hadn't cried, hadn't attended the funeral because Mitchell hadn't told her about it until it was over. Found out from a cousin's Facebook post, a photograph of a casket she recognized by the flowers, lilies, Walter's favorite, surrounded by family members who hadn't thought to call her. I'll take the deed. Pratchett processed the transfer with the same careful efficiency he'd probably applied to every document in this office for the last 40 years. Signatures on lines, initials in boxes, a notary stamp that made worthlessness officially hers. When he handed her the folder, it felt lighter than it should have. 140 acres reduced to 6 pages of legal description and a tax bill of $127 annually that she already couldn't afford. For what it's worth, Pratchett said as she stood to leave, your father talked about that property more than you'd expect. Came in here twice, maybe 3 times, asking about mining rights, geological surveys, zoning classifications. I got the impression he believed there was something up there. Just never found it. My father believed a lot of things. Marlene's voice came out flatter than she intended. Mostly that his daughter wasn't worth investing in. She drove back to Helena in rain that turned the highway into a gray tunnel of windshield wipers and diesel spray from passing trucks. The folder sat on the passenger seat. She didn't look at it. Didn't need to. The property existed in her mind as an abstraction of her father's contempt. 140 acres of steep, worthless terrain given to her as a final insult from a man who'd spent his life making sure she understood her place. The apartment was dark when she arrived. Rent was $1,100 a month for 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where the stove worked on 3 of 4 burners, and the refrigerator hummed with a pitch that suggested imminent mechanical failure. She'd lived here for 7 months since leaving Kevin, since the night he'd thrown a plate at the wall close enough to her head that ceramic fragments cut her cheek, and she'd finally understood that close enough was just practice for the real thing. Her daughters were at the kitchen table. Hannah, 16, doing homework with the aggressive focus of someone who decided education was her escape route. Lily, 12, reading a book about geology that she'd checked out from the school library 3 times running because the school librarian understood that some children needed rocks and fossils more than they needed fiction. Mom, Lily looked up first, her dark eyes cataloging Marlene's expression with the unnerving perceptiveness of children who'd learned to read adult emotions for survival. What did the lawyer say? Marlene set the folder on the counter, hung up her coat, poured water from the tap because the electric kettle had died last week and replacing it wasn't in the budget. Grandpa left me a mountain. Hannah's pen stopped moving. What kind of mountain? The worthless kind. 140 acres of steep hillside in the middle of nowhere. No buildings, no water, no road worth driving on. Assessed at $4,200 total. And Uncle Mitchell? Everything else. The house, the savings, the commercial property downtown. Hannah's expression tightened. That quiet fury she'd inherited from somewhere. Maybe Kevin's side. Maybe from generations of women who'd been handed the short end and told to be grateful. That's not fair. It's exactly what I expected. Then why do you look like that? Hannah's voice carried an edge that was half accusation, half concern. Like you're thinking about something. Marlene didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about something, though she couldn't have explained what. A feeling more than a thought. The way Pratchett had mentioned Walter's visits, his questions about mining rights and geological surveys. The way her father had chosen this particular property as his final message to her. Not nothing, not complete exclusion, but this specific piece of land that he'd held onto for 40 years despite its apparent worthlessness. Walter Calloway had been many things, cruel, dismissive, stubbornly wrong about most of his opinions, but he hadn't been stupid. And stupid men didn't hold on to worthless property for 4 decades, paying taxes every year, making trips to the lawyer to ask questions about mineral rights. Lily closed her geology book. Can we go see it? Marlene looked at her younger daughter. The eagerness in Lily's face was so genuine, so uncomplicated by the layers of family resentment and financial despair, that it cut through the fog of exhaustion like a blade. Yeah, baby. This weekend. We'll go see it. Mitchell called that evening. His voice carried the particular blend of condescension and false concern that he'd perfected over decades of being Walter Calloway's favorite child. At 50, 3 years older than Marlene, he'd built himself into a successful orthodontist in Billings with a practice that generated more annually than Marlene had earned in the last decade combined. His wife drove a Mercedes. His sons attended private school. His Christmas cards featured professional photographs of a family that looked like they'd been assembled from a catalog. Marley, the childhood nickname she hated, delivered with the casual possessiveness of someone who'd never been told no. I heard you picked up the deed. What are you going to do with it? Haven't decided yet. Because I've been thinking. Mitchell's voice shifted into what Marlene privately called his sales pitch. The practiced casualness that preceded an offer designed entirely for his benefit. That property connects to some land I've been looking at. Recreational parcels adjacent to yours. If you'd be willing to sell, I could offer you fair market value. Say, $5,000. Give you a little cushion. Fair market value is $4,200. You're offering above market. See, I'm being generous. Think about it. $5,000 cash. You could use that right now, couldn't you? The question landed where Mitchell intended it to, on the raw nerve of Marlene's financial desperation. $5,000 would cover 3 months of back rent. Would fix the car's transmission. Would buy groceries without the constant mental math of which items to put back at the register. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. The offer has a shelf life. Mitchell's laugh was warm, practiced, entirely hollow. And Marley, try not to be dramatic about Dad's will. He did what he thought was right. You know how he was. After they disconnected, Marlene stood in her kitchen holding the phone and feeling the particular rage that came from being managed by someone who mistook your poverty for stupidity. Mitchell wanted the property, not because it was worth $5,000, but because its proximity to something else gave it value he wasn't disclosing. She pulled out her phone and searched for property records in the Barker Ridge area. The county assessor's website loaded slowly on her cracked screen, but the information was there. Adjacent parcels, ownership records, recent transactions. Most of the surrounding land belonged to the Bureau of Land Management or the State Forestry Division. But 3 parcels, totaling roughly 500 acres, had been purchased in the last 2 years by an entity called Summit Ridge Holdings, LLC. Marlene typed the company name into a search engine. The results were sparse. A registered LLC in Montana, filed 18 months ago, with a registered agent she didn't recognize. No website, no public profile, no indication of purpose beyond the legal minimum required to exist on paper. The kind of shell company that existed specifically to buy property without revealing who was really writing the checks. She searched further. Property taxes on the Summit Ridge parcels had been paid promptly. Zoning inquiries had been filed with the county. Environmental assessments requested. Someone was actively working on developing those 500 acres, and they'd been doing it quietly, without public attention, in the careful, methodical way that suggested plans already in motion. Marlene sat at the kitchen table with her cracked phone and her father's folder and the $5,000 offer from a brother who knew more than he was saying, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly. More like the ghost of hope. The outline of a possibility that she couldn't yet see clearly, but could feel pressing against the edges of her awareness like something trying to break through. Hannah appeared in the kitchen doorway, pajamas on, toothbrush in hand. You're doing that thing. What thing? The thing where you stare at nothing and your brain is going 100 miles an hour. Dad used to say you looked like that before you figured something out. Marlene closed the phone. Get some sleep, sweetheart. Are you going to sell it to Uncle Mitchell? Not tonight. Good. Hannah's voice carried a satisfaction that suggested she'd been hoping for exactly that answer. He doesn't deserve anything else from this family. After the girls were asleep, Marlene spread the property documents across the kitchen table. The legal description placed her 140 acres on the northwest face of Barker Ridge, bounded to the north by Bureau of Land Management territory, to the east by Summit Ridge Holdings parcels, to the south by state forestry land, and to the west by an access road that connected to County Route 12 about 6 miles from the small town of Silver Creek. She studied the topographical map included in the property file. Pratchett had been thorough, including everything Walter had accumulated over the years. Survey maps from 1979, geological assessments from 1982, a faded Forest Service aerial photograph from 1988 showing the hillside after the clear cut, stumps visible from altitude like scattered punctuation marks on a page of brown earth. But it was the geological assessment that stopped her. A 14-page report from Consolidated Mountain Surveys, dated March 1982, that Walter had apparently commissioned at his own expense. The summary page stated what Pratchett had told her. No significant mineral deposits found. Gold traces insufficient for commercial extraction. Copper present, but below economic thresholds. However, tucked behind the summary was a supplemental page that looked like it had been added later, different paper stock, different typeface, a date stamp from 1983. It read simply, additional assessment recommended per conversation with W. Calloway. Subsurface anomalies detected at coordinates 47, 28, 31 N, 113, 4072 W. Further investigation deferred pending funding. Subsurface anomalies. Marlene read the phrase 3 times. It could mean anything: unusual rock formations, underground water, geological oddities that held scientific interest but no commercial value. Or it could mean something else entirely. She checked the coordinates on her phone's map application. They placed the anomaly roughly in the center of her 140 acres, at an elevation of about 6,500 feet, on a section of the hillside that the topographical map showed as relatively flat compared to the steep terrain surrounding it. A shelf or plateau of some kind, maybe natural, maybe carved by ancient geological forces. Walter Calloway had paid for additional investigation, but apparently never followed through. Or had he? The folder contained no further geological reports, no additional surveys, nothing to indicate he'd pursued the anomaly. But he'd held onto the property for 40 more years, paying taxes annually, visiting the lawyer to ask about mineral rights and zoning. Marlene gathered the documents, stacked them neatly, and set them beside her bed where she could see them in the morning light. Sleep came reluctantly, interrupted by the kind of racing thoughts that poverty and curiosity generated in equal measure. She dreamed of mountains, of standing on a hillside covered in stumps, looking out at a valley she'd never seen, feeling the wind carry something she couldn't quite identify. Not cold exactly, more like potential, the temperature of things about to change. The drive to Silver Creek took 3.5 hours through mountain passes that were still carrying early October snow at the highest elevations. Marlene's Honda, 13 years old and hemorrhaging transmission fluid, complained through every gear change. Henna sat in the passenger seat navigating with her phone's GPS since the Honda's original navigation system had died the same year the girl's father had started throwing things. Lily occupied the back seat surrounded by her geology books, a notebook, and a backpack full of collection bags she'd requested specifically for this trip. She pressed her face against the window as the landscape changed from highway commercial strips to ranch land to pine forest to the kind of high country terrain that made humans feel small and geology feel permanent. Silver Creek appeared around a bend in County Route 12 like something that had been built by people who expected the future to arrive eventually and were still waiting. A main street 3 blocks long. A general store that doubled as the post office. A bar called the Ridgeline with a neon sign missing 2 letters. A volunteer fire station. A gas station where the pumps still had analog displays. The whole town carried the particular dignity of places that had survived by being too stubborn to die. Marlene stopped at the general store for water and directions. The woman behind the counter was maybe 60, lean, weathered, with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that assessed newcomers with the casual expertise of someone who'd been cataloging strangers for decades. Her name tag read June. Looking for the old Calloway parcel. Barker Ridge, northwest face. June's expression shifted. Subtle, but Marlene caught it. A flicker of something, recognition, concern, curiosity, she couldn't tell which. You family? His daughter. I inherited it. Another flicker. June pulled a hand-drawn map from beneath the counter like she'd been expecting this question. Maybe not today, but eventually. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the landmarks were clear enough. Take Route 12 north about 4 miles. You'll see an old logging road on the left, marked with a Forest Service gate. Gate's been open for years. Road's rough, but passable if you've got decent clearance. Follow it about 2 miles up. You'll hit the property line where the old blazes are on the trees. Can't miss it. Stumps everywhere from the cut. Marlene took the map. Thank you. June hesitated. then spoke with the careful deliberation of someone choosing words like she was picking her way across a creek on stones. Your father came through here maybe half a dozen times over the years. Always alone. Always heading up to that ridge. Last time was about 3 years ago. He spent 2 days up there. Came back down looking like he'd found religion or lost it. Hard to tell which. Did he say anything about what he found up there? He said the view was worth more than the property. Then he laughed in a way that made me think he wasn't talking about scenery. The logging road was everything June had warned about, and worse. Ruts deep enough to swallow the Honda's modest tires. Water crossings that sent brown spray across the windshield. Grades steep enough to make the transmission whine in protest. Lily loved every second of it, narrating the geological features she observed with the enthusiasm of a professional who happened to be 12. Hannah gripped the dashboard and remained skeptical. They reached the property line after 35 minutes of punishment that the Honda would likely never forgive. The old blazes on the trees were faded but visible, orange paint marks at chest height that marched across pine trunks in a line that climbed the hillside and disappeared into the forest. Marlene parked where the road widened into something that might have been a turnaround decades ago. They climbed out into cold mountain air that smelled like pine resin and recent rain. The silence was absolute in the way only remote mountain terrain could achieve. No traffic, no machinery, no human sound at all. Just wind through pine needles and the distant conversation of a creek somewhere below them. The hillside rose steeply from the road, covered in second-growth pine that had reclaimed the clear cut over 35 years. Between the young trees, the old stumps remained, weathered and gray, some splitting apart, others still solid enough to sit on. The terrain was rocky, uneven, the kind of ground that fought every footstep and rewarded nothing but determination. It's beautiful. Lily's voice carried genuine wonder. She was already crouching beside a rock outcrop, running her fingers over exposed stone with the careful reverence of someone reading scripture. Mom, this is metamorphic. Schist, maybe quartzite. These layers are millions of years old. Hannah looked less inspired. It's a hill covered in tree stumps. I can see why the county can't sell it. But Marlene wasn't looking at the stumps or the stones. She was looking at the view. They'd climbed for maybe 10 minutes, just far enough up the hillside to clear the tree canopy where the second growth hadn't yet reached full height. And from that modest elevation, the valley below opened up like a revelation. Silver Creek sat tiny and perfect in the distance, surrounded by ranch land that stretched toward a river whose name Marlene didn't know. Beyond the valley, mountains rose in layered ridges, blue to purple to white at the highest peaks where last winter's snow still held. The light was the gold amber of October afternoons, warm despite the cold air, painting everything with the kind of beauty that made you understand why people had fought wars over land. Lily appeared beside her. Mom, look at this. Her daughter held up a rock sample she'd collected from the outcrop, gray-green stone with a texture that caught the light. Marlene didn't know enough geology to identify it, but Lily's expression suggested it was significant. This is serpentinite. She turned the rock in her hands. It forms when certain minerals are altered by heat and water deep underground. It's associated with specific types of mineral deposits. What kind of deposits? Sometimes chromium, sometimes magnesium. Sometimes Lily paused, her scientific caution battling her excitement. Sometimes nickel, but I need to test it properly. Can I take samples back? Take whatever you want. It's our hill. They spent the next 2 hours exploring the property. The terrain was challenging, steep in places, rocky throughout. But the hillside held surprises that revealed themselves slowly, the way mountain terrain always does, saving its secrets for those patient enough to look. The shelf Marlene had noticed on the topographical map was real. About halfway up, the steep grade leveled into a plateau roughly 3 acres in size, flat enough to walk comfortably, protected on 3 sides by rock formations that created a natural windbreak. The plateau offered the most dramatic view on the entire property, a 270-degree panorama that made Marlene's breath catch every time she turned around. More interesting was what Lily found at the eastern edge of the plateau. A rock formation that didn't match the surrounding geology, darker stone arranged in what looked almost like a wall, too regular to be entirely natural, but too old to be recent construction. Mom, this looks like it was built. Lily ran her hands along the surface. But not recently. These rocks have been here for decades. Maybe longer. Henna joined them, her skepticism temporarily replaced by curiosity. There's something behind it. She peered over the top of the formation where erosion had created a gap. It looks like there's a space back there. A depression or something. They couldn't access it easily. The rock formation was chest-high and extended about 20 feet along the edge of the plateau. Whatever lay behind it was obscured by accumulated dirt, fallen branches, and decades of mountain weather. Clearing it would require tools and time they didn't have today. But Marlene photographed everything. The rock formation, the plateau, the view from every angle, Lily's mineral samples, the property boundaries as best she could determine them. She marked the coordinates on her phone's GPS, cross-referencing with the Geological Survey's mention of subsurface anomalies. The coordinates matched. Whatever the 1982 survey had detected was directly beneath this plateau, this flat shelf on the hillside with its strange rock formation and its hidden space behind stone walls that might or might not be natural. On the drive back to the main road, Marlene noticed something she'd missed on the way up. Fresh tire tracks in the mud. Not her Honda's pattern, something wider, heavier, the kind of tracks left by an SUV or a truck with aggressive off-road tires. Someone else had been on this road recently. Within the last few days, judging by how the tracks held their shape in the damp soil. She said nothing to the girls but filed the observation away with the growing collection of details that were assembling themselves into a picture she couldn't yet see clearly. That night, back in the Heleno apartment, Marlene made dinner from what was left in the cupboard, pasta with canned sauce, and whatever vegetables hadn't gone past salvageable. The girls ate at the kitchen table while she stood at the counter, scrolling through her phone with one hand and eating with the other. Summit Ridge Holdings kept appearing in her searches, but always at the edges, always in the fine print. Property transactions recorded with the county. Zoning variance requests filed with the Planning Commission. Environmental impact assessments commissioned from a firm in Missoula. All of it methodical, all of it quiet, all of it suggesting a development plan that was well past the conceptual phase and into active implementation. Then she found the Planning Commission agenda, posted 3 weeks ago on the county website, buried in a PDF that took 4 minutes to download on her slow connection. Item 14 on the agenda for the October meeting, still 2 weeks away. Presentation by Summit Ridge Holdings, LLC, regarding proposed recreational development on Barker Ridge. Conceptual review of ski resort and mountain recreation facility. Total projected development area, 1,200 acres. Ski resort. Marlene read the words 3 times, feeling each reading add weight to implications she was only beginning to calculate. Someone was planning to build a ski resort on Barker Ridge. They'd been quietly assembling land, filing permits, commissioning environmental studies, doing everything necessary to transform a remote mountainside into a destination that would draw thousands of visitors and generate millions in revenue. And her 140 acres sat right in the middle of their planned footprint. She pulled up the county's zoning map and overlaid it with the property boundaries she'd identified. Her land occupied a critical position on the northwest face, the exact exposure that ski resorts needed for optimal snow retention and run orientation. The plateau she'd walked that afternoon would be at the perfect elevation for a mid-mountain lodge or lift station. The terrain below it had the grade and length for intermediate runs that attracted the broadest demographic of skiers. Mitchell knew. The realization hit with the force of something that had been obvious all along, but invisible until the right angle of light revealed it. Her brother's $5,000 offer. His casual urgency. His mention of adjacent recreational parcels. He knew about the ski resort. Probably knew about Summit Ridge Holdings. Might even be involved with them. And he'd tried to buy her out for less than 0.1% of what the property was actually worth to the development. Marlene set down her phone. Stood in her kitchen with its 3-burner stove and its dying refrigerator and its eviction-adjacent rent situation, and let the full weight of what she'd discovered settle into her bones. Her father had given her a worthless hillside. Except it wasn't worthless. It was the key to a development worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And someone, probably her brother, possibly others, had been trying to acquire it quietly before she understood what she held. Walter Calloway's letter sat in her jacket pocket. Make something of nothing. That's what smart people do, isn't it? For the first time since she'd read those words, Marlene didn't hear them as an insult. She heard them as a challenge. maybe even an invitation. The phone rang. Mitchell's number. She let it go to voicemail. His message was brief, practice casual. Hey, Marley. Just checking in about my offer. 5,000 cash, quick closing, no hassle. Let me know. And hey, no hard feelings about the will, okay? Dad was dad. We just got to move on. Move on. Like the hillside was nothing. Like she was nothing. Like the pattern of her entire life. Being dismissed, being underestimated, being handed the scraps while someone else took the meal, was something she should simply accept and continue accepting. Marlene deleted the voicemail. Then she opened her laptop, the ancient Dell that the library had given away when they upgraded, and began researching everything she could find about ski resort development, land valuation, zoning law, and what happened when a property owner held the one piece of land that a billion-dollar project couldn't proceed without. She worked until 3 a.m., coffee going cold beside her, eyes burning from the screen, mind racing with calculations and possibilities, and the slow, unfamiliar sensation of leverage. For the first time in years, Marlene Sutter couldn't sleep because of excitement instead of dread. Monday morning arrived with the kind of October cold that reminded Montana residents winter wasn't coming, but had already arrived in everything but name. Marlene dropped the girls at school, Hannah at the high school, Lily at the middle school, each goodbye carrying the particular weight of single parenthood, where every separation felt like a small act of faith that the world would return your children intact. Then she drove to the county planning office. The building sat on Ridgewater's main street. Unremarkable brick exterior, government issue interior, the kind of place where civic life happened in fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable chairs. The reception desk was staffed by a young man whose nameplate identified him as Brian, and whose expression suggested he'd been hired more for his ability to endure boredom than for any particular administrative passion. I need copies of everything filed by Summit Ridge Holdings, LLC. Planning applications, zoning requests, environmental assessments, any public documents. Brian blinked. That's a lot of material. I'll wait. It took him 45 minutes to compile the file. Marlene sat in one of the uncomfortable chairs and read every page as Brian printed them, her highlighter moving across text with the systematic focus that had made her the best accounts receivable clerk at every job she'd ever held before being laid off, when companies discovered software could do her job for less than minimum wage. The Summit Ridge Holdings application was comprehensive, ambitious, and very nearly complete. A four-season mountain resort centered on Barker Ridge, featuring 14 ski runs across varying difficulty levels, a 200-room lodge at the base, a mid-mountain restaurant and warming facility, a gondola system connecting the base to the summit, plus summer recreation including mountain biking, hiking, and what the application called alpine adventure experiences. The projected development cost was $340 million. Economic impact projections showed 800 permanent jobs, $45 million in annual tourist revenue for the county, and a property tax base that would transform Silver Creek from a dying mountain town into a destination community. And buried in the appendix, on page 147 of a 200-page document, was a map of the proposed development area. Marlene's 140 acres were shaded in yellow with a notation that read, "Parcel acquisition pending." They needed her land. Not wanted. Needed. Without it, the primary ski terrain lacked three of its most important intermediate runs. The Mid-Mountain Lodge lost its optimal location, and the gondola route would have to be rerouted at enormous additional cost. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered because she'd learned that avoiding calls from unknown numbers was a luxury that people with money could afford and people without couldn't. Miss Sutter? The voice was male, professionally warm, the kind of voice that sold things for a living. My name is Douglas Pemberton. I'm the project director for Summit Ridge Holdings. I understand you've recently inherited the Calloway parcel on Barker Ridge. News travels fast. Small community. We like to stay connected to what's happening in our project area. Pemberton's laugh was designed to communicate goodwill. It communicated calculation instead. I'd love to sit down with you and discuss the property. We believe there's an opportunity that could be mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial. The phrase that people used when the benefit flowed primarily in one direction. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Could we meet? I'm in Ridgewater today. Coffee or lunch, whatever works for your schedule. They met at the only restaurant in Ridgewater that served lunch, A place called Mountain View that offered neither a mountain nor a view, but compensated with adequate coffee and the kind of small-town atmosphere where everyone knew everyone else's business and pretended not to. Douglas Pemberton arrived in a black SUV, same tire pattern Marlene had noticed on the logging road, and carried himself with the practiced ease of someone who'd made presentations to investors and community boards and anyone else who stood between his projects and completion. Mid-50s, expensive outdoor wear that had never seen actual outdoor use. Handshake calibrated to communicate confidence without aggression. His associate, a woman named Claire Nakamura, carried a leather portfolio and the quiet competence of someone who handled details that mattered. They ordered coffee. Pemberton made small talk about the town, the weather, the beauty of the area. Standard relationship building that Marlene recognized from every car salesman and real estate agent she'd ever encountered. She waited it out, saying little, letting him work toward whatever he'd come to propose. "Miss Sutter, I'll be direct." Pemberton finally arrived at the point, setting his coffee down with the deliberation of someone transitioning from warmth to business. "Our development on Barker Ridge represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity for this region. Jobs, tax revenue, tourism dollars that will transform communities that have been struggling for decades. Your property sits in a location that's important to our plan." "How important?" Pemberton glanced at Claire, who opened the portfolio and produced a map identical to the one Marlene had seen at the planning office. She'd annotated it with highlighted routes and elevation markers that made the presentation look more polished but communicated the same essential truth. "Your 140 acres include terrain that's ideal for several of our planned ski runs. The plateau at the midpoint would be an excellent location for our mid-mountain facilities. Without your parcel, we'd need to significantly redesign the resort layout, which would add cost and reduce the quality of the guest experience. So you need my land. We'd prefer to include it, yes." Pemberton's smile stayed in place. "We're prepared to offer you $50,000. That's more than 10 times the assessed value. A very generous premium that reflects the parcel's strategic importance to our project." $50,000. Marlene let the number sit on the table between them. It was more money than she had, more than she'd earned in the last 2 years combined, more than enough to cover back rent, fix the car, put groceries in the cupboard without the constant anxiety of counting every dollar. But it was also, she now understood, a fraction of what the land was worth to a $340 million development. That's a lot of money for a worthless hillside. Pemberton's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We don't consider it worthless. That's why we're offering above market. Your project documents estimate the resort will generate $45 million annually. My 140 acres contain the terrain for 3 primary ski runs and the optimal lodge location. Without them, your redesign costs add what? $30, $40 million to your budget? And you're offering me $50,000. Claire's pen stopped moving. Pemberton's expression underwent a rapid recalculation. The kind that happened when someone you'd categorized as unsophisticated revealed they'd done their homework. "Ms. Sutter, valuations are complex. The resort's success depends on many factors beyond any single parcel. Then you won't mind if I hold on to mine while those factors work themselves out." Pemberton leaned back. The warmth left his voice, replaced by something cooler and more honest. "Let me be candid. This project has significant backing. Political support at the state and county level. Community enthusiasm, environmental approvals that are nearly complete. Moving forward without your parcel would be inconvenient and expensive, but not impossible. We'd prefer cooperation, but we have alternatives. Then I guess we both have thinking to do." They parted politely, handshakes all around, promises to stay in touch that carried the subtext of a negotiation that had barely begun. Pemberton and Claire drove away in the black SUV. Marlene sat in the Mountain View parking lot, watching them go, feeling the adrenaline of confrontation mixing with the terror of having just turned down $50,000 she desperately needed. Her phone rang again. "Mitchell." She answered this time. "Marley, have you thought about my offer?" Mitchell's voice carried a new note, urgency poorly disguised as casual interest. "5,000 is solid money. You could use it right now." "Mitchell, do you know anything about a company called Summit Ridge Holdings?" The pause lasted exactly long enough to confirm what she already suspected. "Never heard of them." "Why?" "No reason. Just saw the name in some county documents." "Your offer is generous. but I'm going to hold on to the property for now. Marley, don't be stupid about this. His voice sharpened. That land is worthless. You're going to pay taxes on it every year for nothing. Take my money and move on. Thanks for the advice, Mitchell. I'll let you know if anything changes. After she hung up, Marlene sat in the parking lot for another 10 minutes, thinking. Mitchell knew about the ski resort. Probably had a financial interest in Summit Ridge Holdings, or at least an arrangement with them. Their father had left her the land knowing what it would become, or at least suspecting. And Mitchell had been trying to acquire it cheaply before she figured out the truth. Walter Calloway's letter echoed in her memory. Make something of nothing. That's what smart people do, isn't it? Was this what he'd intended? A final test? A twisted gift wrapped in insult? Or had he simply been too stubborn and too proud to tell his daughter directly that he'd left her something valuable, something that required intelligence and determination to unlock? Marlene didn't know. Might never know. Walter Calloway had taken his motivations to the grave along with everything else he'd never been willing to share. But she had the land. She had the information. And for the first time in her adult life, she had leverage over people who'd spent their entire lives having leverage over her. The question now was what to do with it. She started the Honda, listened to the transmission grind through its complaints, and drove toward the highway. Behind her, Barker Ridge rose against the October sky, its northwest face catching the afternoon light in a way that made the old stumps glow like amber. Beautiful and patient and waiting, the way mountains always waited for whatever came next. That evening, Marlene told the girls everything. She'd considered keeping it from them, the way parents reflexively protected children from complications they might not understand. But Hannah was 16 and already understood more about financial hardship than most adults. And Lily was 12 and had the kind of mind that needed problems to solve the way other children needed play. They sat at the kitchen table with the planning documents spread between plates of pasta. Marlene explained the inheritance, the ski resort, Mitchell's deception, Pemberton's offer. She laid it out chronologically, completely, the way she'd have prepared in accounts. Receivable reconciliation in her former career. Facts first, analysis after. Hannah's reaction was immediate and fierce. Uncle Mitchell is trying to cheat you. He knows about the resort, and he offered you $5,000 for land that's worth millions. That's fraud. It's not fraud exactly. It's just Marlene's search for the right word. Taking advantage. Same thing when it's family. Lily's response was different. She'd been studying the geological survey while Marlene talked, cross-referencing the subsurface anomaly notation with her geology textbooks. Her face had the concentrated intensity of someone following a thread that led somewhere important. Mom, these coordinates. The anomaly they found in 1982. She tapped the survey report with one finger. Serpentinite on the surface usually means there's an ultramafic intrusion below. That's igneous rock from deep in the Earth's mantle pushed up through existing formations. And sometimes Lily looked up, her dark eyes bright. Sometimes those intrusions bring valuable minerals with them. Not just the nickel I mentioned before. Sometimes platinum group metals. Palladium, rhodium. Sometimes even rare earth elements, depending on the specific geological history. So there might be something valuable underground? I don't know for certain. I'd need real testing. Proper equipment. But the indicators are there. The serpentinite, the anomaly reading, the fact that Grandpa kept paying taxes on it for 40 years. He must have suspected something. Marlene looked at her younger daughter with an expression that mixed pride and wonder. When did you learn all this? Lily shrugged with the particular modesty of children who didn't realize their knowledge was unusual. I read a lot of books about rocks. Hannah leaned forward. So what do we do? They offered $50,000. That's not enough. But we can't afford a lawyer to negotiate. We can't afford anything. Marlene gathered the documents into a neat stack. For now, we do what I've always done. We figure it out ourselves. We learn everything we can about that property, about the resort development, about what our land is actually worth. And we don't sell until we understand exactly what we're holding. And Uncle Mitchell? Uncle Mitchell can wait. He's been waiting. He can keep waiting. That night, Marlene lay awake in her bed, listening to the apartment settle around her, feeling the weight of possibility pressing against the walls of a life that had been defined by its limitations for as long as she could remember. Outside, Helena's modest skyline glowed against clouds that promised snow. Winter coming in earnest now, the season when Montana reminded everyone who really held the power. In her mind, She kept returning to the plateau on Barker Ridge. The flat shelf with its strange rock formation and its hidden space behind stones that might or might not be natural. The 270-degree panorama that made you feel like you could see the curve of the Earth. The coordinates that matched an anomaly from 1982 that nobody had ever properly investigated. Her father had walked that same ground 3 years ago, had come back down looking like he'd found religion or lost it, according to June at the general store in Silver Creek, had held onto the property for 40 more years of taxes and questions and trips to the lawyer. What had Walter Calloway found up there? What had he been protecting? And why, after a lifetime of dismissing his daughter, had he given it to her instead of Mitchell? The questions multiplied in the darkness, breeding with possibilities that felt both terrifying and intoxicating. Marlene Sutter, 47 years old, broke, divorced, dismissed by her family and overlooked by life, had inherited something that powerful people wanted badly enough to lie about, scheme for, and try to steal through deception. She didn't have money. She didn't have connections. She didn't have the kind of power that came from name recognition or political influence. But she had 140 acres of Montana mountainside that a $340 million ski resort couldn't be built without. And she had 2 daughters who were smarter than anyone gave them credit for. And she had the particular stubbornness of a woman who'd been underestimated so many times that proving people wrong had become not just a habit, but a calling. Tomorrow she'd go back to the mountain. She'd bring proper tools this time. She'd investigate the rock formation and the hidden space behind it. She'd take more samples for Lily to study. She'd photograph everything and document everything and build the kind of careful, methodical case that nobody could dismiss or ignore. And she would not sell. Not for $5,000. Not for $50,000. Not until she understood exactly what she held and what it was worth. Not until the people who dismissed her understood that the woman they'd written off as irrelevant was the one person standing between them and everything they wanted. Walter Calloway's letter sat on her nightstand, unfolded, accusatory, possibly prophetic. Make something of nothing. That's what smart people do, isn't it? Fine, Dad. Marlene whispered to the darkness and to the memory of a man who might have been crueler than he needed to be or wiser than she'd given him credit for. Watch me. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall. On Barker Ridge, 140 acres of allegedly worthless hillside waited beneath a blanket of white, keeping its secrets the way mountains always did, patient, silent, and older than any human ambition that dared to claim them. The snow had been falling for 2 days when Marlene made her second trip to the property. This time she came prepared. Work boots instead of sneakers. Gloves, layers, a headlamp she'd found at a thrift store for $2. A small pry bar and a folding shovel from the Army surplus store, $5 for both, barely used. A thermos of coffee and sandwiches that used the last of the bread and deli meat. Lily had begged to come. Marlene had compromised by promising a weekend trip when school allowed. But this visit needed to be solo. She needed to think without the girl's energy filling the silence, needed to feel the property without distraction, needed to understand it the way you understood any problem, by sitting with it long enough for the answers to surface on their own. The logging road was worse with snow. The Honda fishtailed twice on grades that summer had made merely difficult and winter was converting to genuinely dangerous. But she made it to the turnaround, parked, and started climbing. The hillside looked different under snow. Softer. The stumps wore white caps that made them look almost decorative. The second-growth pines sagged under accumulated weight, their branches forming tunnels of green and white that felt like walking through a cathedral designed by weather. She reached the plateau in 20 minutes, breathing hard from the climb, sweat cooling against her skin despite the layers. The view was even more stunning in winter, the valley below dusted white, the distant peaks sharp, against a sky so blue it looked artificial. The rock formation at the plateau's eastern edge had collected snow in its crevices, and the accumulation actually made the structure more visible, more obviously deliberate. In summer, with moss and lichen and decades of organic debris softening the edges, it could pass for a natural feature. But snow outlined the geometry, the straight lines, the consistent height, the way individual stones had been placed with intention. Someone had built this. Not recently, but with purpose. A wall of native stone, roughly 4 feet high and 20 feet long, constructed to block access to whatever lay behind it. Marlene worked the pry bar into the gap she'd noticed on her first visit. The stone resisted, then shifted, then gave way with a grinding sound that echoed across the silent plateau. She removed 3 stones before the opening was large enough to see through. Behind the wall was a depression in the hillside, not quite a cave, more like a shallow alcove carved into the rock face. Natural, Marlene thought, but improved. The floor had been leveled. The walls showed tool marks where someone had widened the space. It extended back about 8 feet and was wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side. And it wasn't empty. Marlene worked more stones free, creating an opening she could squeeze through. Her headlamp cut through darkness that smelled like cold stone and something else, something metallic and ancient. The beam swept across the alcove's interior and found what her father had found 3 years ago, what he'd never told anyone about, what he'd protected with silence, and a will that made sure it went to the one person he trusted to handle it properly, even if he'd never been able to say those words while he was alive. She sank to her knees on the cold stone floor and stared at what the mountain had been keeping. The headlamp's beam moved across the alcove like a searchlight sweeping a stage, and what it illuminated made Marlene forget the cold, forget the climb, forget every practical concern that had defined her existence for the last decade. Wooden crates, stacked against the back wall in 2 neat rows, 8 crates total, each one roughly the size of a footlocker, each one sealed with iron hasps that had rusted but held. The wood was old, thick-planked, the kind of heavy construction used for shipping before plastic and cardboard replaced craftsmanship with convenience. Stenciled markings on the sides had faded but remained partially legible. U.S. Geological Survey. Barker Ridge Site 7. Confidential. 1943. During the war. Marlene knelt beside the nearest crate, running her fingers across the stenciled letters. The wood felt dense and cold, preserved by the alcove's constant temperature and the dryness that came from being sealed behind a stone wall for decades. Beside the crates, leaning against the wall in a waterproof canvas bag, was a document tube, the kind used for architectural drawings or large-format maps. Marlene opened it with hands that shook from cold and adrenaline in equal measure. Inside were rolled papers, brittle but intact, protected by the tube and the mountain's indifference to time. She unrolled the first sheet on the alcove floor, weighing the corners with stones to keep it flat. A geological map of Barker Ridge, hand-drawn with the meticulous detail of professional cartography, dated August 1943. Survey markers identified mineral deposits across the ridge with annotations in a careful hand that used abbreviations Marlene didn't recognize. But she recognized numbers, and the numbers beside certain markers carried enough zeros to make her vision blur. The second sheet was a letter on War Department letterhead, faded but legible. August 22, 1943. To Colonel James Whitfield, Army Corps of Engineers. Barker Ridge Strategic Mineral Survey. Colonel Whitfield, preliminary results from Site 7 confirm significant deposits of tungsten and molybdenum at depths accessible through conventional mining. Additionally, assay samples from the northwest face indicate the presence of platinum group metals in concentrations that exceed initial projections by a factor of 3. Given the strategic importance of these minerals to the war effort, we recommend immediate classification of all survey data and restriction of public access to the Barker Ridge area. Full exploitation of these deposits should be deferred until proper infrastructure can be established. In the interim, all core samples and assay results should be stored on-site per standard protocol for classified geological resources. Respectfully, Dr. Edwin Marsh, Chief Geologist, Western Division. Marlene read the letter twice, then a third time, slower, letting each sentence build on the last until the full picture assembled itself in her mind like a puzzle whose pieces had been scattered across 80 years. During World War II, the government had surveyed Barker Ridge for strategic minerals. They'd found tungsten, used in armor-piercing ammunition and high-temperature industrial applications. Molybdenum, essential for hardening steel in military equipment. And platinum group metals, among the rarest and most valuable elements on Earth, used in everything from catalytic converters to electronics to industrial chemistry. They'd classified the findings, sealed the survey data, stored the core samples on site, meaning right here, in these crates, in this alcove that someone had constructed specifically to protect them. And then, apparently, they'd forgotten. Or the project had been overtaken by events. Or the bureaucracy had buried it the way bureaucracies buried things. Not through conspiracy, but through the simple entropy of institutional memory. Files misfiled, personnel transferred, priorities shifted by the end of the war and the beginning of the Cold War and all the decades that followed. The crates contained the core samples. Physical proof of what lay beneath the mountain. Evidence that had waited 80 years for someone to find it. Marlene sat back on her heels and stared at the crates with an expression that mixed wonder and terror. Because if these samples confirmed what the letter described, if the platinum group metals were really there in the concentrations Dr. Marsh had documented, then her 140 acres of worthless hillside weren't just strategically important to a ski resort. They were sitting on top of a mineral deposit that could be worth not millions, but potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. And suddenly everything made a different kind of sense. Her father's 40 years of paying taxes, his trips to the lawyer asking about mineral rights, his visit 3 years ago when he'd come down looking like he'd found religion or lost it. Walter Calloway had discovered this alcove, had read these documents, had understood what they meant, and he'd told no one. Why? Marlene's breath came out in clouds that hung in the alcove's still air. Why had her father sat on this information for 3 years? Why hadn't he filed claims, contacted mining companies, done any of the things that a rational person would do upon discovering they owned land worth a fortune? The answer might have been in the third document she unrolled. Not a government letter or a geological map, but a handwritten note on lined paper. Walter Calloway's cramped script unmistakable. Found this October 2021. Spent a year trying to figure out what to do. Talked to a geologist in Missoula. Showed him the assay numbers without telling him where. He said if these numbers are real, the deposit is worth $200 million minimum. Maybe more depending on platinum concentration. Problem is the mineral rights. When I bought this land in '79, the deed was supposed to include subsurface rights. But I've been going through old county records and something's wrong. There's a separate filing from 1952 that transfers mineral rights to an entity called Western Strategic Resources. Never heard of them. County clerk says the filing looks irregular. Maybe fraudulent. Someone separated the mineral rights from the surface rights decades ago, and I can't figure out who or why. If the mineral rights aren't mine, then the deposit doesn't matter. Someone else owns what's underground. I need a lawyer, but lawyers cost money, and I don't want Mitchell finding out. He'd sell this information to the highest bidder without thinking twice. He's my son, but he's got his mother's blood. Cold where it counts. Need to think about this more. Need to figure out who Western Strategic Resources is and whether that filing is legitimate. If it's not, if someone stole the mineral rights through a fraudulent transfer, then the rights revert to the surface owner. To me. Or to whoever I leave this land to. The note ended there. No date. But the reference to his 2021 discovery and subsequent research suggested he'd written it sometime in 2022 or early 2023, before the cancer diagnosis that Marlene only learned about from Mitchell's grudging phone call 6 months before Walter died. Her father had spent his final years trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't afford to solve properly, had died with the answer incomplete, and had left the land, the alcove, and all its secrets to the one child he trusted not to sell out immediately. Make something of nothing. The letter's words took on yet another meaning. Walter hadn't been insulting her. He'd been telling her, in the only way his pride and stubbornness allowed, that the nothing wasn't nothing at all. That making something of it would require the intelligence and determination he'd never openly acknowledged she possessed. Marlene photographed everything. Every document, every crate marking, every angle of the alcove. She didn't open the crates. Whatever was inside needed proper handling, chain of custody that would hold up in legal proceedings if it came to that. She replaced the stones in the wall, not sealing it completely, but restoring enough of the barrier that a casual observer wouldn't notice the disturbance. The drive back to Helena took 4 hours in snow that had intensified from decorative to dangerous. Marlene drove with both hands on the wheel and her mind running calculations she couldn't stop. $200 million minimum, the geologist had told Walter, for platinum group metals alone, plus tungsten and molybdenum, both critical minerals whose prices had risen dramatically in recent years as supply chain concerns made domestic sources increasingly valuable. But the mineral rights question hung over everything like a cloud that wouldn't disperse. If Western Strategic Resources legitimately owned the subsurface rights, then the deposit belonged to them regardless of who owned the surface. Marlene could hold the land forever and never benefit from what lay beneath it. She needed a lawyer. She needed a geologist. She needed resources she didn't have, expertise she couldn't afford, and time that was running out as Summit Ridge Holdings advanced their ski resort development toward the county hearing that was now 10 days away. What she had was 2 daughters, one of whom understood geology better than most adults, and another who understood injustice with the instinctive clarity of someone who'd experienced too much of it. That night, she told them. Hannah's reaction was controlled fury directed at their uncle, at the system, at every mechanism that had conspired to keep their family in poverty while other people profited from what was rightfully theirs. Lily's reaction was scientific excitement tempered by methodical caution. She studied the photographs of the geological map with an intensity that made Marlene's chest ache with pride. The assay numbers are consistent with what I'd expect from an ultramafic intrusion in this type of geological setting. The serpentinite I found on the surface supports it. But Mom, these are 80-year-old samples. The deposit needs modern verification. Ground-penetrating radar, new core samples, proper assay analysis. Can we do any of that without money? Lily was quiet for a moment. Dr. Reeves at the university. My geology teacher mentioned her. She runs the mineral sciences program. Sometimes they do field work on interesting sites for research purposes. If the geological evidence is compelling enough, she might be willing to survey the property as an academic project. You're 12 years old and you're networking with university professors. I'm 12 years old and I read a lot. Lily's smile carried no apology. There's a difference. Hannah had been searching on her phone while Lily talked. Western Strategic Resources. She looked up from the screen. I can't find any active company by that name. No state registration, no federal filings, nothing. But there's an archived Secretary of State record from 1952 showing it was registered as a Montana corporation. Officers listed as Victor Redmond and Charles Whitfield. Whitfield. Marlene felt the connection click. The USGS letter was addressed to Colonel James Whitfield, Army Corps of Engineers. Hannah's eyes widened. Same family. Could be a coincidence. Could be the son or nephew of the colonel who oversaw the survey, helping himself to the mineral rights after the project was classified and forgotten. They worked until midnight, building a timeline from fragments. The Geological Survey in 1943. The classification of results. The creation of Western Strategic Resources in 1952, 9 years later, by individuals with possible connections to the original survey team. The transfer of mineral rights from the surface property to this new entity. Then silence. No mining activity, no development, no evidence that Western Strategic Resources had ever done anything with the rights they'd acquired. Why would someone steal mineral rights and then never use them? Hannah's question cut to the heart of the puzzle. Maybe they couldn't. Marlene thought out loud. The survey data was classified. They couldn't develop the minerals without revealing how they knew they were there. If anyone investigated, the connection to the original survey would surface, and the fraudulent transfer would be exposed. So they sat on it, waited for the classification to expire or the records to be lost or everyone involved to die. And now? Lily asked. Now it's 80 years later. Everyone from the original survey is dead. The records are buried. The classification probably expired decades ago, but nobody knew to look for it. The mineral rights are just sitting there in a county filing cabinet, attached to a company that doesn't exist anymore, owned by nobody. Does that mean the rights revert to us? I don't know. Marlene's honesty felt like both weakness and strength. I think so, but we need legal help to be sure. The phone rang at 7:30 the next morning. Marlene was making coffee with grounds she'd stretched to twice their recommended ratio, producing a liquid that was technically coffee in the same way that the apartment was technically habitable. The number was local, Helena, area code. She answered with the caution of someone who'd learned that morning phone calls rarely brought good news. Miss Sutter? The voice was female, professional, carrying the particular energy of someone who'd been awake and working for hours before calling. My name is Patricia Okonkwo. I'm an attorney with the Montana Legal Aid Society. I understand you may need some help. Marlene's confusion was genuine. I didn't contact legal aid. No, but a mutual acquaintance did. Gerald Pratchett called our office yesterday. He said he'd handled your father's estate and believed you might be in a situation that required legal assistance you couldn't afford. He was very discreet about details. Just said it involved property rights, and that time was a factor. Pratchett, the quiet lawyer in Ridgewater who'd read Walter's cruel letter without comment and handed over the deed to worthlessness. He'd made a call, without being asked, without telling her. The kind of small-town kindness that existed below the surface of communities that outsiders dismissed as simple. Patricia Okonkwo arrived at the apartment that afternoon. She was 38, direct, dressed practically, and carried herself with the specific confidence of someone who'd spent years fighting battles on behalf of people the legal system was designed to overlook. Her briefcase was worn at the corners. Her eyes missed nothing. Marlene told her everything. The inheritance, the ski resort, Mitchell's deception, Pemberton's offer, the alcove, the documents, the mineral rights question. She laid out the photographs and Walter's handwritten notes and watched Patricia's expression cycle through surprise, calculation, and something that looked remarkably like contained excitement. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Patricia set down her coffee, untouched. You own 140 acres that a $340 million ski resort needs for its development. Beneath those acres, there may be a mineral deposit worth $200 million or more. And the mineral rights may have been fraudulently transferred to a shell company 80 years ago by individuals connected to the original government survey. That's the short version. And your brother, who knew about the ski resort, tried to buy the land for $5,000. Also correct. Patricia was quiet for a full minute. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful precision of someone laying out a legal strategy. There are several issues here, each requiring different approaches. First, the mineral rights. If the 1952 transfer was fraudulent, we can petition the court to void it and restore the rights to the surface owner. That's you. The evidence you've described, the connection between the transferees and the original survey team, the dormant shell company, the lack of any subsequent activity, all of that supports a fraud claim. Second, the ski resort. Your property is essential to their development. That gives you significant leverage in any negotiation, but it also makes you a target. Companies with $340 million budgets don't negotiate politely when someone stands between them and their investment. Third, and this concerns me most, your brother. If Mitchell has a financial relationship with Summit Ridge Holdings and attempted to acquire your property at a fraction of its value without disclosing that relationship, that's potentially actionable. At minimum, it's a breach of familial duty. At worst, it's fraud. Can you help with all of this? Legal aid handles cases for clients who can't afford representation. Your income qualifies. And frankly, Patricia's expression shifted to something closer to personal investment. This is the kind of case I went to law school for. Powerful interests exploiting vulnerable people over land rights. It's practically the history of Montana compressed into a single property dispute. They spent 3 hours building a legal strategy. Patricia would file a quiet title action on the mineral rights, challenging the 1952 transfer. She'd also file a motion to intervene in the County Planning Commission hearing on the ski resort development, establishing Marlene's rights as a property owner whose land was directly impacted by the proposed development. In the meantime, Patricia wanted the core samples professionally examined. Chain of custody mattered. If this went to court, every piece of evidence needed to be handled with forensic precision. Your daughter mentioned a Dr. Reeves at the university? Lily has connections I don't even understand. Good. Let's use them. Dr. Catherine Reeves turned out to be exactly the kind of person Lily's instincts had identified. A mineral sciences professor in her early 60s whose passion for geological fieldwork hadn't diminished despite decades of academic politics and funding struggles. She had silver-streaked black hair, workmanlike hands that suggested she spent more time with rock samples than paperwork, and a directness that made Marlene feel instantly comfortable. They met at the university lab, a cluttered space that smelled like stone dust and machine lubricant. Lily had come along, school having granted her an excused absence that her geology teacher had enthusiastically supported. Dr. Reeves greeted Lily like a colleague, which made Marlene's daughter stand 2 inches taller. Marlene showed the photographs and the geological documents. Dr. Reeves studied them with the slow, deliberate attention of someone whose professional reputation depended on accuracy. If these assay numbers are legitimate, and I have no reason to doubt them given the survey methodology of that era. Then you're describing a significant platinum group deposit. PGMs are among the most valuable metals on Earth. Current market price for platinum is roughly $900 an ounce. Palladium is running around $1,000. Rhodium can exceed $4,000 depending on market conditions. She pointed to specific numbers on the geological map. These concentration levels, if confirmed by modern analysis, suggest a deposit that could sustain commercial mining for decades. Conservative valuation, given current prices and extraction costs, would be in the range of $150 to $250 million. Possibly more if rare earth elements are also present, which the geological setting suggests is plausible. Dr. Reeves set the photographs down and looked at Marlene with an expression that mixed professional excitement with personal concern. I'd like to survey this site properly. Ground-penetrating radar, new core samples, full geochemical analysis. The university has the equipment and the expertise. I can frame it as a research project, which means no cost to you. But I need to be transparent. If we confirm what these documents suggest, the academic publication alone would be career-defining. I have my own interests in this. Marlene appreciated the honesty. As long as I maintain control over when and how the results are made public. Absolutely. Your property, your timeline. I just want to be the first to publish when you're ready. They scheduled the survey for the following Saturday. Dr. Reeves would bring a team of graduate students and equipment. Lily would assist. Marlene would supervise. Patricia would document everything for legal purposes. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Marlene sat at the kitchen table with the photographs from the alcove spread before her like tarot cards. The War Department letter, the geological map, Walter's handwritten note, each document a thread in a tapestry that was only now beginning to reveal its full pattern. She thought about her father, not the man who dismissed her ambitions and favored her brother and died without saying I love you in any language she could understand. The other Walter, the one who'd driven to Barker Ridge alone, year after year, paying taxes on worthless land because something told him it wasn't worthless. The one who'd found the alcove and read the same documents and faced the same impossible puzzle of mineral rights and fraudulent transfers and forces too large for one person to fight. He'd been scared. She understood that now, not of the mountain or the secrets inside it, but of what would happen if the wrong people learned what he'd found. He'd spent his whole life in the orbit of men who took what they wanted, men like Mitchell, men like the faceless investors who'd eventually come calling. Walter had known he couldn't protect the discovery by himself, couldn't afford the lawyers, couldn't navigate the legal system, couldn't fight a battle that required resources he'd never possessed. So he'd hidden it, sealed it behind a stone wall and a lifetime of silence. And in the end, he'd left it to the one person he believed might be stubborn enough, resourceful enough, and desperate enough to do what he couldn't. The realization didn't erase 47 years of feeling invisible, didn't undo the birthday parties Walter had missed or the college applications he'd refused to support or the wedding he'd attended without smiling. But it added something to the ledger, a line item she hadn't expected, one that read, in his own way, your father bet on you. The week between felt like waiting for a verdict. Marlene went through the motions of ordinary life, dropping the girls at school, searching for jobs online, stretching the grocery budget until it screamed, fielding calls from Mitchell that she let go to voicemail. Each message carried escalating urgency disguised as brotherly concern. Marley, I'm getting worried about you. Let's talk about this reasonably. The county hearing on the ski resort was approaching. 7 days now. Summit Ridge Holdings had been making their case to the community, hosting information sessions at the Silver Creek Town Hall, distributing glossy brochures showing architectural renderings of a resort that would transform the region. Jobs, revenue, opportunity. The narrative was polished and comprehensive, and it left out one critical detail. They didn't own all the land they needed. Thursday evening, Marlene was washing dishes when headlights swept across the apartment's kitchen window. An unusual occurrence on a street where most residents drove older vehicles that announced themselves with engine noise long before their lights arrived. These headlights were quiet, attached to a vehicle that purred rather than rumbled. A knock at the door. Marlene dried her hands, checked the peephole, and found Mitchell standing on her landing. Not alone. Behind him, hands in the pockets of a coat that cost more than Marlene's rent, stood Douglas Pemberton. She opened the door without greeting. Mitchell's expression carried the particular combination of impatience and forced warmth that he deployed when negotiations weren't going his way. Pemberton's face was neutral, professional, the mask of someone who dealt in transactions and understood that emotions were obstacles to efficiency. "Marley, we need to talk." She didn't invite them in. The apartment's visible poverty, the cracked linoleum, the stained ceiling, the furniture sourced from thrift stores and curb alerts, would give them ammunition she didn't want to provide. Instead, she stepped onto the landing and pulled the door closed behind her. "Talk." Mitchell glanced at Pemberton, received a slight nod, and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed pitch. "The resort project is moving forward. County hearing next week. Environmental approvals are nearly complete. Marley, this is going to happen with or without your property. If you work with us, everyone benefits. If you fight this, you're going to get hurt. Is that a threat? It's reality." Pemberton's voice was calm, measured, carrying the authority of someone who'd handled obstinate property owners before and always won. "Miss Sutter, I understand you feel the initial offer was insufficient. I respect that. That's why we're prepared to increase our offer to $150,000, 3 times our original proposal. For 140 acres of steep, undeveloped terrain with no infrastructure, no water rights, and significant access challenges, that's extraordinarily generous. $150,000. The number was real money. Life-changing money for someone in Marlene's position. Enough to relocate, start over, give the girls stability they'd never had. Enough to stop the constant arithmetic of survival. But it was also, she now knew, less than 0.1% of the mineral deposit's estimated value. Less than a rounding error in the resort's $340 million budget. Generous the way a $5 tip on a $1,000 dinner was generous, technically more than nothing, but fundamentally insulting when you understood the scale. "I need time to think about it." Mitchell's composure cracked. "Marley, stop playing games. You don't have time. The hearing is in a week. After that, the county may exercise eminent domain for the development. You'll get market value for $1,000 and no choice in the matter. Eminent domain for a private ski resort? For economic development that serves the public interest." Pemberton's voice was smooth. 800 jobs, $45 million in annual revenue. The county has every reason to support this project with whatever tools are available. The threat was clear. Sell voluntarily at their price or be forced to sell at the county's price, which would be even less. Either way, they expected her to lose. "I'll give you my answer before the hearing." They left. Mitchell squeezed her arm as he passed, the gesture carrying ownership rather than affection. "Be smart about this, Marley. For once in your life, be smart." After they drove away, Marlene stood on the landing in the cold, watching her breath crystallize in the air, feeling the familiar weight of being told what she was. Not smart, not capable, not worthy of the consideration that money and power and masculine confidence automatically commanded. Hannah appeared in the doorway. "I heard everything. I know. They're going to try to take it, aren't they? They're going to try. What are we going to do?" Marlene looked at her daughter. At 16, Hannah had already survived more than most adults would face in a lifetime. Domestic violence, poverty, the particular betrayal of watching your mother be diminished by people who were supposed to love her. And through all of it, Hannah had maintained a fury that Marlene was only now learning to match. "We're going to fight." Saturday arrived with cold sunshine that made the snow on Barker Ridge glitter like crushed diamonds. Dr. Reeves brought 3 graduate students, a truck full of equipment, and the barely contained excitement of a scientist approaching a potentially historic discovery. Lily rode with them, having been granted honorary team member status that she wore with solemn pride. Patricia drove separately, her car loaded with documentation equipment and the quiet determination of an attorney who understood that this day's findings would determine the legal strategy for everything that followed. Hannah stayed behind, positioned at the apartment with a prepaid phone Marlene had bought specifically for this purpose. If anything happened, if Mitchell showed up, if Pemberton's people made contact, Hannah would call immediately. At 16, she was already a better sentinel than most adults. The survey took 6 hours. Dr. Reeves' team set up ground-penetrating radar on the plateau, running systematic sweeps that mapped the subsurface geology in detail that the 1943 survey could never have achieved. The equipment hummed and clicked, translating geological structures into digital images that appeared on a laptop screen in real time. Lily assisted with sample collection, her careful technique earning quiet approval from the graduate students who were 3 times her age. She labeled each specimen with coordinates and depth, maintaining the chain of custody that Patricia had specified. The core samples from the crates were examined on-site. Dr. Reeves opened each one with the reverent care of an archaeologist handling artifacts, which in a sense she was. The samples were intact, preserved by the alcove's stable environment, each one labeled with coordinates and depth measurements from the original 1943 survey. She ran preliminary field tests on several samples, using equipment that could identify mineral composition within minutes. Each test result made her expression more intense, more focused, more carefully controlled in the way of scientists who understood that premature excitement could compromise objectivity. By late afternoon, the team gathered on the plateau as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Dr. Reeves addressed the group with the formality of someone making an official statement. Preliminary results are consistent with the 1943 survey documents. Ground-penetrating radar shows a significant subsurface formation at depths of 40 to 120 meters. The formation's characteristics are consistent with an ultramafic intrusion containing platinum group metals, tungsten, and molybdenum. Core sample analysis confirms elevated concentrations of platinum and palladium, with indications of rhodium that will require laboratory verification. She turned to Marlene with an expression that abandoned scientific restraint for simple human honesty. Miss Sutter, pending full laboratory analysis, I believe you are standing on top of one of the most significant undiscovered mineral deposits in the northern Rocky Mountains. Conservative estimates based on today's findings suggest a total in situ value in excess of $200 million. Lily's hand found Marlene's, small fingers gripping tight. The graduate students were looking at each other with the wide-eyed disbelief of people who'd just participated in something they'd tell their grandchildren about. Patricia stepped forward. Dr. Reeves, would you be willing to provide an affidavit attesting to these preliminary findings? For legal purposes, I'll provide whatever documentation you need. This is too important for anything less than full transparency. They packed up the equipment as sunset turned the valley below into a painting. The light caught the snow on the distant peaks and turned them rose gold, and for a moment the entire landscape looked like something from a dream about what life could be if beauty and justice existed in the same world. Marlene stood on the plateau with Lily beside her, looking out at the view that Walter Calloway had said was worth more than the property. He'd been right, in his way. The view was priceless, but what lay beneath their feet might be worth even more. On the drive home, Lily fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from 6 hours of fieldwork. Marlene drove through darkness, headlights cutting tunnels through forest that pressed close on both sides. Her phone buzzed. A text from Hannah. Uncle Mitchell came by. Brought a man I didn't recognize. They knocked for 10 minutes. I didn't answer. They left something in the mailbox. Marlene's grip tightened on the wheel. What was it? An envelope. Haven't opened it. Waiting for you. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, carrying the embossed logo of a law firm in Billings that Marlene recognized as one of the most expensive in the state. Inside was a letter that made the threats on her landing feel like preludes. Dear Miss Sutter, this firm represents Summit Ridge Holdings, LLC, and its affiliated investors in the Barker Ridge Resort development. It has come to our attention that you have refused reasonable offers to purchase the Calloway parcel, which lies within the project's approved development footprint. We are writing to inform you that our client intends to petition the county for condemnation of the property under Montana's Economic Development Eminent Domain statutes. Additionally, we have reason to believe that the mineral rights to the subsurface beneath your property are held by Western Strategic Resources, a Montana corporation. Any claims you may assert regarding subsurface resources are therefore unfounded and potentially fraudulent. Finally, we note that your daughter, a minor, has been observed trespassing on adjacent Summit Ridge Holdings parcels during what appears to be unauthorized geological survey activity. We reserve all rights regarding this trespass, including the right to seek injunctive relief and damages. We strongly urge you to reconsider the generous offer extended by our client. Further resistance will result in legal action that you are not financially positioned to withstand. Sincerely, Crawford, Webb and Associates. Marlene read the letter 3 times. Each reading revealed another layer of threat. Eminent domain. Mineral rights challenges. Accusations of trespass against Lily. The message was clear. Surrender or be destroyed. Hannah watched her mother's face. What does it say? Marlene folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen table beside the geological survey photographs and Patricia's notes and Lily's carefully labeled rock samples. Evidence and threats occupying the same space, the same table, the same life. It says they're scared. Scared? When people send letters like this, it means they're worried. If they had the power to simply take what they wanted, they wouldn't waste money on lawyers threatening a single mother in a rental apartment. They just do it. They're trying to intimidate us because intimidation is cheaper than the alternative. What's the alternative? Paying us what the land is actually worth. She called Patricia that night. The attorney's response was swift, precise, and carrying the controlled anger of someone who recognized bullying dressed in legal language. The eminent domain threat is toothless. Montana law requires a demonstrated public purpose, and a private ski resort doesn't qualify without significant legal gymnastics. The mineral rights claim is interesting. They're acknowledging the deposit exists, which actually helps us. And the trespass accusation against Lily is absurd and retaliatory. She was on your property. I'll respond in writing tomorrow. They know about Western strategic resources. Of course they do. Patricia's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd seen this pattern repeated across dozens of cases. Powerful people don't just buy land. They buy information. They've probably known about the mineral deposit for years. That's the real reason they want your property. The ski resort is the public justification. The minerals are the actual prize. You think the whole resort is a cover? Not entirely. A resort would be profitable on its own. But the minerals underneath are worth multiples of the resort's total revenue. Build the resort, get the infrastructure approved, roads, power, water treatment, then quietly begin extraction operations under the cover of resort maintenance and expansion. By the time anyone notices mining equipment on a ski slope, the permits are in place and the minerals are coming out of the ground. The sophistication of the scheme took Marlene's breath away. It wasn't just fraud. It was strategy executed across years, across agencies, across the polite fiction that a ski resort was the real objective. The resort was the disguise. The mountain's bones were the target. That night, Marlene checked the locks on every door and window twice. Not because she believed locks could stop determined people with unlimited resources, but because the ritual of checking gave her something to do with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She looked in on the girls. Hannah slept with her phone beside her pillow, even in sleep prepared for emergencies. Lily had fallen asleep with her geology textbook open to a chapter on igneous intrusions, her fingers still marking a page like she'd been mid-thought when exhaustion overtook her. These girls, these brilliant, resilient, underestimated girls who'd survived their father's violence and their family's poverty and the slow erosion of being told, in 1,000 small ways, that they didn't matter. They deserved more than this apartment, and its leaking faucet, and its 3-burner stove. They deserved more than a mother who counted pennies at the grocery store and lay awake calculating which bills could be paid late without consequences. They deserved a future, and Marlene was going to build one, even if she had to tear down every obstacle that powerful men placed in her path. The silence that followed was filled with implications Marlene was only beginning to process. Summit Ridge Holdings didn't just want her hillside for ski runs. They wanted what was beneath it, a mineral deposit worth more than the entire resort development. And they'd been trying to acquire it quietly, cheaply, before she understood what she owned. Mitchell. The word came out of Marlene like an accusation she'd been holding for decades. He knew everything. The resort, the minerals, Western strategic resources. He tried to buy me out for $5,000 because he knew what was underground and he wanted it for himself. Or for his partners. We need to find out who's behind Summit Ridge Holdings. The real owners, not the LLC filing. If your brother has a financial interest, that changes everything. The county hearing was in 4 days. 4 days to untangle 80 years of fraud, document a mineral deposit, challenge a corporate development plan, and protect her family from people whose resources exceeded hers by orders of magnitude. Marlene hung up the phone and sat in her kitchen, surrounded by evidence and threats, and the sleeping sounds of her daughters in the next room. She thought about Walter Calloway, About a man who'd kept secrets because he didn't trust anyone with them, who'd died alone with a puzzle he couldn't solve, who'd handed it to his daughter with an insult that was really an act of faith. She thought about the alcove on the mountain, about 80-year-old core samples waiting in the darkness for someone to care about what they contained, about a geological survey classified and forgotten while wars and decades and generations passed overhead without disturbing the stone. And she thought about her daughters, Hannah's fierce intelligence, Lily's scientific wonder, the lives they deserved that poverty and circumstance had been systematically denying them. Monday morning, Patricia called with news that shifted the ground beneath everything. I found the connection. Western Strategic Resources was dissolved in 1978 for failure to file annual reports. Under Montana law, when a corporation is involuntarily dissolved, its assets are supposed to revert through a prescribed process. But the mineral rights were never properly transferred because nobody knew they existed. They've been in legal limbo for over 40 years. What does that mean for us? It means the rights are contestable. We file a quiet title action claiming the original transfer was fraudulent and that the dissolution of Western Strategic Resources left the rights without a valid owner. As the surface owner, you have the strongest claim. And the connection to the original survey? Patricia's voice carried satisfaction. Charles Whitfield, co-founder of Western Strategic Resources, was the son of Colonel James Whitfield, who oversaw the 1943 Geological Survey. Victor Redmond was the field assistant on the survey team. They used classified government information to steal mineral rights from the rightful owner, who at the time was the federal government. When the land was sold as surplus after the war, the mineral rights should have transferred with the surface rights. They didn't because Whitfield and Redmond had already separated them through a fraudulent filing. This is fraud on a massive scale. Federal fraud, technically. Theft of classified government property. But the perpetrators are long dead. What matters now is establishing that the transfer was void and the rights belong to you. Can we do this before the county hearing? We can file before the hearing. Resolution will take longer. But the filing itself creates a cloud on the mineral rights that prevents anyone else from claiming them while the case is pending. That includes Summit Ridge Holdings. Do it. The filing went in Tuesday afternoon. Patricia hand-delivered copies to the county recorder's office, the state court, and, as a strategic move, to the offices of Crawford, Webb and Associates. Let them know the game had changed. The response came faster than expected. Wednesday morning, Mitchell's car appeared in Marlene's parking lot. He didn't knock. He waited, engine running, until Marlene came out to confront whatever this was. She approached the car. Mitchell rolled down the window. His face carried an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not anger, not condescension, but something closer to fear. What have you done? Filed a legal action to protect my property rights. You filed a quiet title action on mineral rights worth you don't even understand what you're playing with. He ran his hands through his hair. Marley, these people, the investors behind the resort, they're not local businessmen. They're an international mining consortium that's been quietly acquiring mineral rights across the Northern Rockies for 15 years. The ski resort is a front. It's the justification they need for infrastructure, roads, power, water, that they'll use for mining operations once the resort is established. So you knew. Of course I knew. Mitchell's voice cracked. I've been working with them for 3 years. They approached me because Dad owned the land and I was the heir apparent. When he left it to you instead, they told me to acquire it. The $5,000 was their initial offer. They've been increasing the pressure ever since. You were going to let them steal $200 million worth of minerals from your own sister for $5,000. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Mitchell leaned forward, and in the cold morning light, Marlene saw something she hadn't expected. Desperation. Not the calculated urgency of a man whose business deal was falling apart, but the genuine terror of someone caught between forces he couldn't control. They have things on me, Marley. Financial records. Tax irregularities. Deals I made that weren't exactly legal. If I don't deliver the property, they'll destroy me. They'll take the practice, the house, everything. And if you don't sell, they won't just come after me. They'll come after you. After your girls. Are you threatening my daughters? I'm warning you. These aren't people who accept no. They didn't build a 15-year acquisition strategy to be stopped by a single mother who got lucky with an inheritance. Marlene looked at her brother. Really looked at him. past the orthodontist's confidence and the expensive clothes and the lifetime of being their father's favorite. And she saw what Walter Calloway had apparently seen clearly enough to cut Mitchell out of the one thing that actually mattered. A man who would sell anything to protect himself, including his sister, including his nieces. Get out of my parking lot, Mitchell. Marley, please. Get out. And if anyone comes near my daughters, I will burn everything to the ground, including you. He drove away. Marlene stood in the cold, shaking with anger and adrenaline. Watching his car disappear around the corner of a building that housed a life she was increasingly certain she'd outgrown. She stood there for another 5 minutes, letting the cold settle into her bones, letting it replace the heat of confrontation with something steadier and more useful. Clarity. The kind that came from finally seeing a situation stripped of pretense and family obligation and the residual guilt that daughters carry for fathers who never earned it. Mitchell was compromised, not just morally, which she'd always suspected, but legally, financially, completely. He'd entered into an arrangement with people who treated mineral deposits like chess pieces and human beings like pawns. People who'd built a 15-year strategy to extract wealth from Montana's mountains while disguising it as tourism and community development. And Mitchell had been their inside man, their family connection to the one piece of land they couldn't proceed without. The question now wasn't whether to fight, but how to fight effectively against opponents who'd been planning this for longer than her marriage had lasted. Inside, Hannah was recording everything on her phone, having watched from the window with the instinct of someone who'd learned that documentation was protection. She played back the audio. Mitchell's voice, clear enough to capture every admission, every threat, every confession of complicity with an international mining consortium that had been using a ski resort as cover for mineral acquisition. Send that to Patricia. Marlene's voice was steadier than she felt. All of it. The county hearing was tomorrow. That evening, Marlene sat at the kitchen table with Patricia on speakerphone, building the presentation they'd deliver to the Planning Commission. The legal filing was in place. The geological evidence was documented. Mitchell's recorded admissions provided context that transformed a property dispute into something much larger. Dr. Reeves called with laboratory results that confirmed what the field tests had suggested. Platinum group metals in concentrations that exceeded even the 1943 estimates. Modern assay techniques had detected additional elements the wartime equipment couldn't measure. Total estimated deposit value, revised upward, $280 million. The number was so large it felt fictional. Marlene wrote it on a piece of paper and stared at it until the digits stopped looking like symbols and started looking like a future. Hannah helped organize the presentation materials. Lily prepared geological explanations, simplified for a lay audience, that would demonstrate the deposit's significance. Both girls understood that tomorrow wasn't just about property rights or money. It was about whether a family that had been systematically dismissed and exploited could stand up in a public forum and demand to be seen. Marlene ironed the one good blouse she owned, a navy button-down that she'd kept from her last office job, the one luxury she hadn't sold or donated during the downward spiral of the last 3 years. She laid it across the kitchen chair and looked at it the way a soldier might look at armor. Tomorrow she would walk into a room full of people who expected her to be nobody, who'd already decided that her worthless Hillside would become their ski resort and their mineral mine and their profit center, who'd tried threats and bribes and family betrayal and legal intimidation to make her disappear. She wouldn't disappear. She'd been disappearing her entire life, into her father's shadow, into her brother's expectations, into Kevin's rages, into poverty's relentless erasure of identity and agency. Tomorrow she would be visible. Tomorrow she would stand up in front of people who decided she didn't matter and show them what she'd found, what she'd earned, what she refused to give away. Walter Calloway's letter sat on the nightstand. Make something of nothing. Done, Dad. Marlene whispered to the darkness, to the memory of a complicated man who'd found the only way he could to tell his daughter he believed in her. Watch what I do with it. She set the alarm for 5 a.m. The hearing started at 9, and she wanted time to review everything one more time. Time to dress carefully, to make sure the navy blouse was pressed and her posture was straight and her voice was ready to carry across a room full of people who expected her to fold. Lily had prepared handouts. Geological cross-sections simplified into diagrams that a high school student could follow, with the mineral deposit highlighted in colors that made its significance impossible to ignore. At 12, she'd produced presentation materials that would have been credible at a professional conference. Hannah had organized the legal documents into a binder with color-coded tabs, each section labeled in her precise handwriting. Timeline, evidence, financial connections, threats. The binder was thick enough to require both hands to carry, and every page represented a piece of the truth that Summit Ridge Holdings had spent years and millions trying to keep buried. Patricia had prepared the legal motions and filed everything that could be filed in advance. She'd also reached out to a contact at the state attorney general's office, passing along the preliminary evidence of fraud and the suggestion that an international mining consortium was using a domestic ski resort as cover for mineral extraction. The contact had expressed what Patricia described as significant interest. The pieces were in place. The evidence was documented. The allies were committed. All that remained was the fight. Outside, snow fell on Helena. On Barker Ridge, 140 acres of mountain waited beneath a blanket of white, keeping its treasure the way it had kept it for 80 years. Patient, silent, and ready. Tomorrow, the world would learn what a worthless Hillside was actually worth. And the people who'd built their plans on the assumption that Marlene Sutter was nobody would discover what happened when nobody decided to become somebody. Morning arrived the way Montana mornings do in late October, with a cold so clean it felt surgical. Marlene was awake before the alarm, had been awake for an hour already, lying in bed staring at the ceiling while her mind rehearsed arguments and counterarguments and responses to responses in an endless loop that sleep couldn't interrupt. The apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator's terminal hum and the soft breathing of her daughters in the next room. She showered in water that took 4 minutes to warm up, dressed in the navy blouse and the only pair of dress pants she owned, black, slightly too loose from weight, she'd lost without trying because anxiety burned calories the way furnaces burned wood. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, really looked, and saw a woman who could have been 10 years older than 47. Lines around the eyes from squinting at spreadsheets and worry in equal measure. Gray threading through dark hair she hadn't been able to afford to color in 2 years. Hands that were strong but showed the wear of manual labor and domestic survival. But the eyes were clear. That was something. Whatever else the last few weeks had taken from her, they'd given her clarity. The particular sharpness of vision that came from finally understanding the shape of the battlefield and knowing, with a certainty that felt almost physical, that she was not going to retreat. Hannah was already up, dressed in clothes she'd chosen with the deliberate care of a teenager who understood that appearance was armor. Dark jeans, a clean sweater, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older and more serious than 16. She'd printed extra copies of the presentation materials and organized them in folders with the efficiency of someone who'd inherited her mother's gift for systems and added her own flair for strategy. Lily emerged wearing a shirt with a geological cross-section printed on the front, something she'd found at a thrift store months ago and saved for what she called important rock days. Her backpack contained mineral samples, her notebook, and a laminated chart she'd made showing platinum group metal prices over the last decade, a visual that turned abstract numbers into a story anyone could follow. Patricia met them in the parking lot of the Ridgewater County Administration building at 8:15. She carried a litigation bag that looked like it had survived a dozen courtrooms and emerged each time with more scars and more victories. Her suit was professional without being flashy, the wardrobe of someone who understood that credibility came from preparation, not appearance. "How are you feeling?" Patricia's question was directed at Marlene, but her eyes moved across all three of them, assessing readiness. Terrified. Marlene's honesty surprised even herself. And ready, both at the same time. That's exactly right. Patricia permitted herself a small smile. Fear means you understand the stakes. Ready means you've done the work. Both together means you're prepared for whatever happens in there. The county administration building was a 2-story structure that combined architectural ambition with budgetary reality, brick and glass that aspired towards civic importance and landed somewhere closer to functional adequacy. The hearing room occupied the 2nd floor, a space designed for perhaps 80 people that was already filling when they arrived at 8:30. Marlene recognized some faces. June from the Silver Creek General Store, sitting near the back with an expression of quiet alertness. Gerald Pratchett, The Ridgewater lawyer who'd started everything by making a phone call to legal aid without being asked, seated in the middle row with a leather briefcase he didn't open. Several people she didn't recognize who carried the look of Silver Creek residents, weathered and practical, people who'd come because a proposed ski resort on their mountain was their business whether outsiders thought so or not. Douglas Pemberton occupied the front row on the left side, flanked by Claire Nakamura and two men in suits who radiated the particular confidence of attorneys billing by the quarter hour. His presentation materials were already set up on an easel near the podium, glossy renderings of the proposed resort showing happy skiers against mountain vistas that looked nothing like the actual terrain of Barker Ridge. Mitchell sat 3 rows behind Pemberton, trying to look uninvolved and failing. His posture was rigid, his eyes moving between Marlene and Pemberton with the nervous frequency of someone monitoring 2 threats simultaneously. The County Planning Commission consisted of 5 members seated at a raised table at the front of the room. The chairman, a man named Harold Briggs who'd held the position for 12 years, called the meeting to order at precisely 9 a.m. With the practiced authority of someone who'd gavelled more meetings than he could count and found satisfaction in procedure the way other people found it in hobbies. The first 3 agenda items passed quickly: zoning variances, building permits, routine matters that the commission handled with the efficiency of long practice. Then Briggs consulted his agenda and adjusted his reading glasses. Item 4. Summit Ridge Holdings, LLC. Conceptual review of proposed recreational development on Barker Ridge. Mr. Pemberton, you may present. Pemberton stood with the fluid confidence of someone who'd given this presentation dozens of times to investors and officials and anyone else whose approval was required. He moved to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and launched into a narrative that was polished to a high gloss. The renderings showed a resort that looked like something from an architectural magazine. Lodge buildings with timber frames and stone facades that suggested mountain authenticity while delivering luxury comfort. Ski runs carved through pristine forest. A gondola system rising from a base village to a summit station with panoramic views. The numbers were equally impressive. 800 permanent jobs. $45 million in annual tourist revenue. $12 million in property taxes. Infrastructure improvements that would benefit the entire county. Pemberton spoke for 20 minutes. His voice modulated between enthusiasm and sincerity with the precision of someone who'd been trained to persuade and had never encountered a room he couldn't work. Claire supplemented with technical details, environmental assessments, traffic studies, economic projections, the kind of comprehensive documentation that suggested thoroughness while actually functioning as a wall of data designed to overwhelm scrutiny. The commission members listened with expressions ranging from impressed to cautiously interested. Briggs asked procedural questions. Another commissioner, a woman named Rodriguez, inquired about water rights and wastewater capacity. The questions were legitimate but gentle, the kind asked by people who'd already formed favorable opinions and needed only the appearance of due diligence. Then Briggs turned to the room. Public comment period is now open. Speakers will be limited to 5 minutes each. Please state your name for the record. Patricia stood first. Patricia Okonkwo, representing Marlene Sutter, property owner of the Calloway parcel, 140 acres within the proposed development footprint. The room shifted. Pemberton's expression tightened. Mitchell leaned forward in his seat. The commissioners exchanged glances that suggested this was not part of the script they'd been following. Patricia moved to the podium with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd been in harder rooms than this one. She didn't use visual aids. Didn't need them. Her weapon was information, delivered with the surgical precision of someone who understood that truth, properly presented, could cut through any amount of corporate polish. Members of the commission, Summit Ridge Holdings has presented an impressive vision for Barker Ridge, but they've omitted several critical facts that this body needs to consider before proceeding. She opened her litigation bag and placed documents on the podium one by one, each placement deliberate, each document a building block in an argument that was about to dismantle everything Pemberton had constructed. First, Summit Ridge Holdings does not own or control all of the land required for this development. My client's 140-acre parcel sits at the geographic center of the proposed resort. Without it, 3 primary ski runs, the Mid-Mountain Lodge, and the gondola's optimal route are not feasible. Mr. Pemberton's presentation included my client's land in its renderings without her consent and without disclosing that acquisition of this parcel is, in his own words, pending. That's a material omission in a presentation to a government body. Pemberton's lead attorney rose halfway from his chair. Chairman Briggs, this is a conceptual review, not a land acquisition hearing. Property negotiations are separate from planning considerations. Briggs waved him down. Let her finish. Second, Patricia continued without acknowledging the interruption, the true purpose of this development is not recreation. It's mineral extraction. My client's property contains a geological deposit of platinum group metals, tungsten, and molybdenum with an estimated in situ value exceeding $280 million. This deposit was documented by a classified U.S. geological survey in 1943. The core samples and survey documents were recovered from the property and have been verified by Dr. Catherine Reeves of the University of Montana's Mineral Sciences program. The room's energy changed. Not a sound, not a movement, but a frequency shift that Marlene could feel in her chest. People stopped breathing. Commissioners stopped pretending to take notes and actually started taking them. Patricia placed Dr. Reeves' affidavit on the podium. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted last week confirmed the deposit's presence at depths consistent with the 1943 findings. Laboratory analysis of core samples shows platinum and palladium concentrations that exceed initial estimates. This isn't speculative. This is verified. Third, the mineral rights to this deposit were fraudulently separated from the surface rights in 1952 by individuals connected to the original government survey. We have filed a quiet title action with this court challenging that transfer. Documents recovered from the property demonstrate that Charles Whitfield, son of Colonel James Whitfield, who oversaw the 1943 survey, used classified government information to file a fraudulent mineral rights transfer to a shell company called Western Strategic Resources. That company was involuntarily dissolved in 1978, and the mineral rights have been in legal limbo ever since. She turned slightly, not looking at Mitchell directly, but angling her body, so the implication was clear. Fourth, my client's brother, Mitchell Calloway, has been working with Summit Ridge Holdings for approximately 3 years. He attempted to purchase my client's property for $5,000 without disclosing the resort development, the mineral deposit, or his financial relationship with the development entity. We have recorded statements from Mr. Calloway confirming this arrangement and indicating that he was pressured by international investors whose primary interest is mineral extraction, not tourism. Mitchell's face drained of color. He looked like a man watching his own execution from a distance too close for comfort and too far for intervention. The people sitting near him shifted in their seats, unconsciously creating distance the way crowds distance themselves from trouble. Patricia's voice remained level, almost conversational, which made the content of her words land with greater impact. Finally, my client has received threats. A letter from Crawford, Webb & Associates threatened eminent domain, challenged her mineral rights, and accused her 12-year-old daughter of trespassing on her own family's property. These threats constitute witness intimidation and are part of a pattern of coercion designed to force a property owner to surrender land worth hundreds of millions of dollars for a fraction of its value. She gathered her documents with the methodical care of someone who understood that presentation mattered, that the way you handled paper communicated as much as the words printed on it. This commission has a choice. You can approve a development based on incomplete information and compromised motivations. Or you can pause, investigate the facts we've presented, and ensure that public resources aren't used to facilitate private mineral extraction at the expense of a Montana family's legal rights. Patricia returned to her seat beside Marlene. The room erupted into murmured conversation that Briggs silenced with his gavel. Mr. Pemberton, do you wish to respond? Pemberton stood, and for the first time since Marlene had met him, the professional veneer showed cracks. Not panic, he was too experienced for that, but the visible recalculation of someone whose prepared responses no longer matched the questions being asked. These allegations are unfounded and appear designed to delay a project that will bring enormous benefits to this community. Ms. Okonkwo's claims about mineral deposits are based on 80-year-old government surveys and preliminary analysis that hasn't been peer-reviewed. The suggestion that our development is a cover for mining operations is conspiracy theory, not evidence. Dr. Reeves stood from her seat in the middle of the room. She hadn't been scheduled to speak, but the moment demanded it. Chairman Briggs, my name is Dr. Catherine Reeves, professor of mineral sciences at the University of Montana. I conducted the geological survey Ms. Okonkwo referenced. My findings are preliminary but robust. I'm happy to submit to peer review. I'm also happy to testify under oath that the mineral deposit on the Calloway parcel is real, significant, and worth investigating before any development proceeds that might compromise access to a nationally significant strategic mineral resource. The word strategic landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Strategic minerals, platinum, tungsten, molybdenum, had become national security concerns in recent years as supply chain disruptions and geopolitical tensions made domestic sources increasingly critical. A deposit of this magnitude on American soil wasn't just a property dispute. It was a matter of federal interest. Commissioner Rodriguez leaned forward. Dr. Reeves, when you say nationally significant, what do you mean specifically? I mean that if these concentrations are confirmed at scale, this deposit would represent one of the largest undeveloped sources of platinum group metals in the continental United States. The strategic implications for defense manufacturing, clean energy technology, and industrial independence from foreign suppliers are substantial. The room went very quiet. The kind of quiet that happened when people realized they were witnessing something that exceeded the scope of a county planning commission hearing. Something that belonged in congressional hearings and federal agency briefings. Something that would not stay contained in this room regardless of what the commission decided. Briggs consulted with his fellow commissioners in whispers that carried urgency. When he turned back to the room, his expression had shifted from administrative routine to genuine concern. Given the information presented today, the commission is tabling the Summit Ridge Holdings application pending further investigation. We're requesting that the applicant provide full disclosure of all investors and financial backers, including any international entities with interests in mineral extraction. We're also requesting that the State Geological Survey Office conduct an independent assessment of the mineral claims. This matter is continued indefinitely. Pemberton's lead attorney was on his feet. Chairman, this is unprecedented. You can't table a conceptual review based on unverified allegations from an interested party. Briggs removed his reading glasses and looked at the attorney with an expression that suggested 40 years of public service had given him a finely calibrated sense for when he was being managed. I just did. We're adjourned. The hearing room emptied in waves. Pemberton and his team left first, moving quickly, phones already pressed to ears, the urgent choreography of damage control beginning before they'd cleared the building. Claire Nakamura gathered the presentation materials from the easel with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose job had just become significantly more complicated. The glossy renderings of happy skiers and luxury lodges looked different now, not aspirational but deceptive, props in a performance that had just been interrupted by reality. Mitchell slipped out through a side door, avoiding eye contact with everyone, a man whose calculation of where to stand had just been catastrophically revised. Marlene watched him go and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but sadness. The particular kind that came from watching someone you'd grown up with reveal themselves to be exactly the person you'd feared they were. June from Silver Creek approached Marlene in the hallway, her weathered face carrying an expression that mixed admiration with something older and deeper, the recognition of one Montana woman seeing another Montana woman refuse to be pushed around. Your father would have been proud today. He never could have done what you just did, but I think he always hoped someone would. Did you know? About the minerals? June shook her head. I knew he found something up there. Knew it changed him. But he never told me what. Never told anyone, as far as I know. Just kept paying those taxes and driving up that road and keeping his own counsel the way stubborn men do. When they're holding something too big for one person. Gerald Pratchett was waiting by the building's entrance. He shook Marlene's hand with the formal warmth of a professional who'd just watched his instinct vindicated. I'm glad I made that call to legal aid. So am I, Mr. Pratchett. More than you know. Patricia walked them to the parking lot, her litigation bag swinging with the lightness of a burden partially lifted. That went as well as it could have. The commission did the right thing. But this isn't over. Summit Ridge won't go away. They'll regroup, find new angles, apply pressure through channels we haven't anticipated. The real fight is just beginning. Marlene buckled her seatbelt and looked at her daughters in the rearview mirror. Hannah was grinning with the fierce satisfaction of someone who'd watched justice function the way it was supposed to. Lily was already taking notes in her geology notebook, documenting the hearing's proceedings with the same care she applied to rock samples. The drive back to Helena felt different. Not shorter, not easier, but different in the way that altitude changes the quality of air. Something had shifted. The road was the same. The car was the same. The apartment waiting at the other end was the same 3-burner stove. Dying refrigerator rental it had been that morning. But Marlene Sutter was not the same person who'd driven this route in the dark before dawn. She'd stood up. In a room full of people with more money, more power, more institutional authority than she'd ever possess, she'd stood up. Not alone. Patricia had been the voice, Dr. Reeves had been the expertise, Hannah and Lily had been the support. But the decision to stand, to refuse, to fight instead of fold, that had been hers. And it had mattered. The weeks that followed moved at the particular speed of legal proceedings and institutional investigation, which was to say they crawled when Marlene wanted them to sprint and sprinted when she needed them to pause. The State Geological Survey Office dispatched a team to Barker Ridge within 10 days of the hearing. Their assessment was more comprehensive than Dr. Reeves' preliminary study, involving equipment and personnel that only government agencies could deploy. The results, released 6 weeks later, confirmed everything. The Barker Ridge deposit was real, substantial, and significant. Platinum group metals at concentrations that exceeded even Dr. Reeves' estimates. Tungsten deposits of commercial quality. Molybdenum in quantities that would support extraction for decades. And, as Lily had speculated, rare earth elements present in the deeper formations, including neodymium and praseodymium, critical components in electric vehicle motors and wind turbine generators that were currently sourced almost entirely from China. The state report's language was cautious and scientific, but its conclusion was unambiguous. The Barker Ridge deposit represents a strategically significant domestic source of critical minerals. Further investigation and responsible development of this resource should be considered a priority for both state and federal authorities. The news coverage that followed the report's release transformed Marlene's story from a local property dispute into a national narrative. A single mother, a worthless hillside, a $280 million mineral deposit hidden beneath stumps and second-growth pine. The details were too compelling for media to resist, and reporters from outlets Marlene had never heard of began calling her phone at all hours. She gave exactly one interview. A local journalist named Rachel Torres who'd covered the county hearing and followed the story with the kind of persistent attention that distinguished genuine journalism from content production. The interview ran in the regional paper and was picked up nationally, not because Marlene said anything dramatic, but because she said something true. Rachel asked her what it felt like to discover she'd been sitting on a fortune. Marlene had thought about the question for a long time before answering. It felt like being told a secret that changed the meaning of everything that came before it. Every year my father paid taxes on that land. Every time my brother called it worthless. Every moment I spent wondering why Dad left it to me instead of just leaving me nothing. All of that had a different meaning once I understood. The hardest part wasn't the fighting or the lawyers or the threats. The hardest part was accepting that my father believed in me and never found a way to say it. I wish he had. I wish he'd just said it once. The quiet title action moved through the courts with speed that Patricia attributed to the case's extraordinary circumstances. The evidence of fraud was overwhelming. Charles Whitfield and Victor Redmond had used classified government information to steal mineral rights from what was then federally owned land. The shell company they'd created had never mined, never developed, never done anything with the rights except hold them in legal limbo for decades. The judge voided the 1952 transfer in a ruling that took 14 pages to explain what could have been said in one sentence. The mineral rights belonged to the surface owner. Marlene Sutter owned everything. The surface, the subsurface, the stumps and the stones, and the platinum, and the palladium, and the rare earth elements that lay beneath 140 acres of allegedly worthless Montana hillside. The federal interest arrived in the form of a phone call from the Department of the Interior. Polite, professional, carrying the particular weight of a government agency that understood strategic minerals were not just economic resources, but matters of national security. They wanted to discuss the deposit. They wanted to discuss responsible development. They wanted to discuss partnerships that would serve both Marlene's interests and the country's. Patricia negotiated with the careful precision of someone who understood that government partnerships could be either protective or extractive depending on the terms. What emerged was a framework that preserved Marlene's ownership while establishing a development path that would bring the minerals to market responsibly. Environmental protections, community benefit agreements, revenue-sharing structures that ensured the wealth generated by the mountain would flow first to the people who lived in its shadow. The numbers were staggering. Conservative projections showed royalty income of $8 to $12 million annually once mining operations reached full capacity. Total lifetime value of the deposit, depending on market conditions and extraction efficiency, ranged from $280 million to over $400 million. Marlene sat in Patricia's office and stared at documents that described her as the sole owner of a mineral deposit worth the price of a small country's annual budget. The same woman who'd been counting pasta servings 3 months ago. The same woman whose father had given her a worthless Hillside with a note that said make something of nothing. Mitchell's legal situation resolved with the particular ugliness that family betrayals always carried. The state attorney general's office investigated his relationship with Summit Ridge Holdings and found what Patricia had suspected, a financial arrangement in which Mitchell would receive a percentage of the mineral revenue in exchange for facilitating the property acquisition. The arrangement constituted fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to defraud a family member. Marlene didn't press criminal charges. Patricia advised her she could, that the evidence was more than sufficient, that a jury would convict without hesitation. But Marlene remembered Walter Calloway's letter, the cruelty mixed with something that might have been love, and she understood that punishing Mitchell wouldn't heal anything that was actually broken. Instead, she let the civil consequences speak. Mitchell's involvement with Summit Ridge became public. His orthodontic practice suffered as patients discovered that their dentist had conspired to cheat his own sister out of a fortune. He sold the Billings house, downsized his life, lost the Mercedes and the private school and the Christmas card photos that had looked like catalog spreads. Marlene didn't gloat, didn't call, didn't send a letter full of recriminations that she'd earned the right to write. She simply let the silence speak, the same kind of silence that Mitchell had used for years when he'd failed to invite her to their father's funeral, when he'd failed to share information about the resort, when he'd failed to be the brother that family was supposed to mean. But 6 months later, when Mitchell called from a number she almost didn't recognize because he'd had to change providers to save money, she answered. His voice was smaller than she'd ever heard it. Stripped of the orthodontist's confidence and the favorite son's entitlement. Stripped of everything except the raw vulnerability of a man who'd lost his way and wasn't sure he deserved to find it again. Marley, I don't know what to say. Then just listen. She told him about the deposit, about the development plans, about the government partnership and the revenue projections and the future that was taking shape on the mountain their father had quietly protected for 40 years. Then she told him about the scholarship fund she'd established, the Walter Calloway Foundation, dedicated to supporting first-generation college students from rural Montana communities, funded by mineral royalties that would flow for decades. Named for a man who'd told his daughter that girls didn't need college, and then spent his last years making sure she inherited the one thing that would prove him wrong. Mitchell was crying. The ugly, uncontrolled kind that came from somewhere below the surface where the real person lived when they stopped performing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Marley. I know. Can you forgive me? Marlene thought about forgiveness, about what it meant and what it cost, and whether it was something you gave because the other person deserved it or because you deserved the freedom of not carrying the weight. I can try. That's all I can promise. It wasn't resolution. Not the clean, narrative kind where wounds healed and families restored themselves through a single conversation. It was messier than that. Harder. Mitchell would have to earn trust that he'd spent a lifetime squandering. Marlene would have to practice a generosity that didn't come naturally to someone who'd been on the receiving end of dismissal for 47 years. Both of them would have to learn to be different people than the ones their father had shaped them into. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, Marlene had learned, were the only things that mattered when everything else had been stripped away. Mitchell visited Silver Creek in March. Drove up alone in a car that was noticeably less expensive than the one he'd parked in her Helena lot months ago. He stood on the porch of her new house and looked at Barker Ridge with an expression that carried so many competing emotions it was impossible to catalog them all. Regret, certainly. Shame. But also wonder, the kind that came from seeing something you dismissed reveal itself to be extraordinary. The girls were cautious around him. Hannah polite but distant, her body language communicating boundaries that Mitchell understood he'd earned. Lily more forgiving, asking him questions about his teeth, about how braces worked, about the engineering of orthodontic devices, because Lily's curiosity didn't discriminate between people who'd earned her trust and people who hadn't. Knowledge was knowledge regardless of its source. They ate dinner together. The conversation was careful, full of pauses and redirections, the verbal equivalent of walking across ice that might or might not hold your weight. Mitchell asked about the mine, about the ski area, about the foundation that bore their father's name. Each question came out tentative, as if he understood that his right to curiosity about her life had been forfeited and was being extended on credit he hadn't earned. After dinner, they sat on the porch in the cold, breath visible, stars emerging in a sky so clear it made Helena's modest glow feel like light pollution from another planet. Dad came up here 3 years before he died, Marlene said. Found the alcove, found the documents. Spent his last years trying to figure out the mineral rights puzzle. Alone, because he didn't trust anyone enough to ask for help. Mitchell was quiet for a long time. That sounds like Dad. It does. And I spent my whole life being angry at him for being that way. For being closed off. For not trusting me. But he did trust me, Mitchell. In the end, the only thing he trusted anyone with, he gave to me. Not because I was his favorite. Because I was the one he believed would do the right thing with it. Mitchell's voice was rough. He was right. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. Two siblings sitting with the wreckage of a family dynamic that had been dysfunctional for decades, not pretending it was fixed, not pretending it could be fixed by a single dinner and a porch conversation, but acknowledging that the work of repair was worth beginning. Summit Ridge Holdings dissolved quietly, its investors disappearing back into the international networks that had deployed them. The ski resort that had been the public face of their operation evaporated like morning fog, leaving behind nothing but glossy renderings and economic projections that would never be tested. But the idea of a resort didn't die. It transformed. It was Lily who suggested it first, with the matter-of-fact practicality of a 13-year-old who saw connections that adults overlooked. Mom, the mining won't use all 140 acres. The plateau is above the deposit. The ski terrain is mostly on the surface. Why can't we have both? The question led to conversations that led to plans that led to a development. Proposal unlike anything the county had seen before. A modest ski area, not a luxury resort, but a community mountain, designed for local families and regional visitors. 10 runs instead of 14. A day lodge instead of a 200-room hotel. Affordable lift tickets that prioritized access over exclusivity. The mining operation would be underground, accessed from the property's eastern boundary, invisible from the ski runs and the lodge and the plateau where the alcove still held its secrets behind a stone wall that Marlene had rebuilt with her own hands. The County Planning Commission approved the proposal unanimously. Commissioner Rodriguez, who'd asked the question about strategic significance at the original hearing, told a reporter that it was the most thoughtful development plan she'd reviewed in 20 years of public service. Silver Creek transformed slowly, the way mountain towns do, not overnight, but season by season. The ski area brought visitors who spent money in the general store and the diner and the bed and breakfast that June opened in her spare bedrooms because she understood hospitality the way she understood weather, instinctively and without pretension. New businesses appeared on the 3-block Main Street. A coffee shop run by a young couple from Missoula who'd been priced out of their own city and found in Silver Creek the kind of community they'd been searching for. A bookstore that stocked geology books prominently because the owner had heard about the 12-year-old who'd helped discover a fortune under a mountain. An outdoor equipment shop that catered to hikers and skiers with gear that was functional rather than fashionable, priced for working families rather than destination tourists. The town's population grew from 4,200 to just over 5,000 in the first year. Not a boom, not a transformation that would have overwhelmed the infrastructure and character that made Silver Creek worth living in. A steady, manageable growth that the community absorbed with the same patience it applied to everything else. New families, new businesses, new children in schools that had been slowly shrinking for a decade. The Ridgeline bar replaced its missing neon letters and added a menu that went beyond beer and peanuts. The volunteer fire station got new equipment funded by increased property tax revenue. The library expanded its hours and hired a second librarian, a young woman who organized a geology club for children that met Saturday mornings and attracted kids from 3 adjacent counties. The mining operation created 47 permanent jobs, most of them filled by local residents who'd been commuting hours to find work. Environmental monitoring was continuous and transparent, funded by the operation's revenue and overseen by a community board that included June, Gerald Pratchett, and 2 Silver Creek residents who'd attended the original hearing and never stopped paying attention. Marlene moved to Silver Creek with the girls the following spring. Not to a mansion or an estate or anything that looked like the sudden wealth she'd acquired. To a house on the edge of town, 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen with a stove where all 4 burners worked, a view of Barker Ridge from the back porch that never stopped being astonishing. The house had a workshop in the back where Hannah, now 17, had started a small business refurbishing furniture. She discovered she had Walter Calloway's hands, capable and precise, suited to the patient work of restoration that transformed discarded things into objects of value. The metaphor wasn't lost on her, or on Marlene. Lily enrolled in Silver Creek School and immediately became the most popular student in the science department. Not because she tried to be popular, but because genuine enthusiasm was contagious, and a 13-year-old who could explain plate tectonics using the rocks in the schoolyard was the kind of person other kids wanted to sit next to. Dr. Reeves became a regular visitor, her research on the Barker Ridge deposit evolving into a multi-year project that attracted graduate students from across the country. She and Lily had developed a mentorship that transcended the usual boundaries of age and credentials. When Lily presented her own mineral analysis at a regional geology conference that spring, Dr. Reeves introduced her as the future of American geological science. Lily had blushed and then delivered a presentation that made 3 professors in the audience ask for her contact information. Patricia Okonkwo won a statewide legal award for her work on the case. She used the acceptance speech to talk about legal aid funding and the structural inequities that allowed powerful interests to exploit vulnerable communities. She didn't mention Marlene by name, but everyone in the room knew whose story she was telling. And on a Saturday morning in June, 8 months after a woman with a dying refrigerator and $127 in back property taxes had walked into a lawyer's office and inherited a worthless hillside, Marlene stood on the plateau of Barker Ridge and watched the sun rise over a valley that she could now, in a very real sense, call home. The view was the same one Walter Calloway had described as worth more than the property. The same one that had taken her breath away on her first visit with the girls. But it meant something different now. Not just beauty, though the beauty remained, unchanged by human drama, indifferent to the disputes and discoveries that had played out on its slopes. It meant possibility, the particular kind that came from understanding that the life you'd been living wasn't the only one available, that the story other people had written for you, the dismissed daughter, the struggling mother, the woman who couldn't, wasn't the only story that existed. Lily appeared beside her, already dressed for field work, her backpack loaded with equipment that Dr. Reeves had helped her select. Morning sample collection awaited, part of the ongoing research project that was documenting the deposit's characteristics with the thoroughness that Lily brought to everything she cared about. Hannah was down at the house, where the sound of power tools suggested furniture was being transformed from broken to beautiful with the same stubborn determination that ran through 3 generations of Calloway women, whether the Calloway men had ever noticed it or not. "Mom, do you think Grandpa really knew what he was doing?" Lily's question came out of nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. "When he left you the mountain?" Marlene considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about Walter Calloway, about a man who'd been wrong about almost everything, wrong about women and education and what his children needed and how to show love without it looking like a weapon. A man who'd been stubborn and dismissive and emotionally absent in ways that had left scars she'd carry forever. But also a man who'd driven to this mountain alone, year after year, who'd found an alcove full of secrets and understood their significance, who'd spent his final years trying to protect a discovery he knew was too big for him to handle alone, who'd looked at his two children and, in the end, chosen the one he'd spent a lifetime underestimating. Not because she was his favorite, because she was the one he trusted. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Marlene's voice was steady. I think he was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about this. About me. About us. He just couldn't say it out loud. So he said it with a Hillside. Lily smiled. That's a very grandpa way to say I love you. It is. They stood together on the plateau, mother and daughter, watching light fill the valley below. The town of Silver Creek emerged from shadow as the sun climbed. Smoke from chimneys, the glint of vehicles on the main street, the modest geometry of a community that was growing carefully, deliberately, in a way that honored what it had been while becoming something new. Behind them, the alcove in the rock face had been properly documented, its contents removed to secure storage, its entrance marked with a small bronze plaque that Marlene had commissioned. Site of the 1943 Barker Ridge Geological Survey. Classified by the War Department. Discovered by Walter Calloway, 2021. Revealed by Marlene Sutter, 2024. Some things are worth the wait. Below the plateau, the first traces of the mining operation's surface infrastructure were visible. A road, properly engineered and environmentally monitored, leading to the portal entrance on the eastern face. Equipment buildings that blended with the terrain through design choices that Lily had insisted upon and the mining engineers had grudgingly respected. Nothing that marred the view. Nothing that betrayed the mountain's essential character. And above the plateau, the upper slopes where next winter's ski runs would open for the first time. Trails cleared and graded through second-growth forest, following the natural contours of the terrain, designed not for maximum vertical drop or international competition, but for the specific joy of families who wanted to spend a day on a mountain together without mortgaging their futures for the privilege. The Barker Ridge Community Ski Area. 10 runs. 1 lodge. Lift tickets priced for locals. A mountain that belonged to its community instead of to investors whose addresses were in different time zones and whose interest in Montana extended exactly as far as what they could extract from its soil. The financial details had settled into a structure that Patricia had negotiated with the federal government and the mining company that would operate the extraction. Marlene retained ownership of both surface and mineral rights. The mining operation leased extraction rights at royalty rates that would generate $8 to $12 million annually for the next 30 to 40 years. The ski area operated as a community benefit corporation, with revenues funding local schools, infrastructure, and the Walter Calloway Foundation. The foundation had already awarded its first scholarships. 14 first-generation college students from rural Montana communities, each receiving full tuition and living expenses for 4 years. The selection committee included June from Silver Creek, Gerald Pratchett, and a high school counselor from Helena who'd written the recommendation letters for Hannah's own college applications. Marlene had read every application personally. 237 students from towns she'd never visited, writing essays about parents who worked double shifts and grandparents who'd never finished high school and dreams that felt impossible until someone said, "Here, this is for you. This is because someone believes you can." She'd cried through most of them, not from sadness, but from recognition. These were her stories, her struggles, her children's futures written in different handwriting from different kitchen tables in different rental apartments across Montana, but carrying the same weight, the same hunger, the same stubborn refusal to accept that the circumstances you were born into defined the person you could become. The Foundation's motto, chosen by Lily with the concision of a scientist and the heart of a child who understood exactly what mattered, was 4 words long. Worth more than assessed. Hannah was applying to architecture programs. She wanted to design buildings that respected the landscapes they occupied, structures that enhanced rather than displaced the communities they served. The portfolio she'd assembled included photographs of furniture she'd restored and drawings of buildings that married function and beauty with the particular grace that came from understanding both craftsmanship and constraint. Marlene looked at her older daughter's application essays and saw sentences that made her eyes burn. "My mother taught me that being underestimated is not the same as being insufficient. That the resources you lack are never as important as the resourcefulness you possess. That every problem is really just a question nobody has bothered to answer yet." Kevin had sent a letter. Not a threatening one, Not an angry one. Just a short note that carried the particular sadness of a man who'd understood too late what his violence had cost him. It said he was in treatment. It said he was sorry. It said he didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted her to know the girls were lucky to have her. Marlene had read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer where she kept things that mattered but didn't need to be revisited often. Forgiveness was a road she might walk someday. Today she had other paths to follow. She'd built something she hadn't expected alongside the mine and the ski area and the foundation. She'd built a life. Not the glamorous kind that sudden wealth was supposed to produce. Not the mansions and sports cars and lifestyle inflation that television taught people to expect when ordinary individuals came into extraordinary money. A real life. Quilts on beds that she'd sewn herself because the habit of making things with her hands was too much a part of her identity to abandon just because she could afford to buy them. Dinners cooked in the kitchen with the four-burner stove, not because she had to count every meal anymore, but because the act of feeding her daughters was an expression of love that money couldn't replicate or improve. She'd kept the Honda, bought a new truck for winter driving and practical purposes, but the Honda sat in the garage, transmission still grinding, paint still fading, a monument to the vehicle that had carried 3 women up a mountain road to discover their future. Hannah had suggested painting it gold. Lily had suggested donating it to a museum. Marlene had suggested they mind their own business, and all 3 of them had laughed in a way that made the house feel full. The first snow of the next season arrived in early November, coating Barker Ridge in white that transformed the ski runs from abstract lines on a map into actual terrain waiting for actual people. Marlene stood at the base lodge, which was really just a large cabin with a cafeteria, a rental shop, and a warming area with a fireplace big enough to gather around, and watched the first lift chairs swing upward, carrying Silver Creek residents who'd never been able to afford a day at the corporate resorts 2 valleys over. Children's voices carried across the cold air, that particular frequency of excitement that only snow and speed and the absence of adult worries could generate. Parents stood at the base watching, coffee in gloved hands, faces carrying the specific expression of people who'd been given something they'd stopped believing was possible. June appeared beside Marlene, wrapped in a down jacket that had seen 20 winters and was prepared for 20 more. Her silver braid hung over one shoulder, and her eyes moved across the scene with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a community come back to life. You know what's different about this place? June's voice carried over the sound of the lift mechanism and the distant shouts of children discovering speed. It's ours. Not some corporation's idea of what we should want. Not some developer's vision of luxury that we can't afford. Just a mountain and some runs and a place to get warm afterward. Simple. The way things are supposed to be. Marlene watched a father help his young daughter onto a beginner run. The child wobbled, nearly fell, caught herself, and slid forward with the uncertain triumph of someone discovering that balance was something you found by moving, not by standing still. My father never learned how to say what he meant. Marlene's voice was quiet, meant for June and the mountain and the memory of a man who'd hidden love inside insults because vulnerability was a language he'd never been taught. But he said it anyway. Just took me 47 years to hear it. June nodded. Men like that, they can't build bridges with words. So they build them with other things. Property. Silence. Puzzles that take their daughters decades to solve. Doesn't make it right, but it makes it real. That evening, Marlene walked through the base lodge after the last skiers had gone home. Lily was in the corner helping Dr. Rees review mineral samples that had arrived from the mining operation's latest extraction, a teenager and a professor working side by side, with the easy collaboration of people united by curiosity and purpose. Hannah was sketching in her architecture notebook, drawing modifications to the lodge that would add a deck facing the sunset view. The same view that had taken Marlene's breath away on her first visit, the one Walter had said was worth more than the property. Patricia called with news that the state attorney general had opened a broader investigation into Summit Ridge Holdings' activities across the northern Rockies. 3 other properties had been identified where similar patterns existed: quiet acquisition of surface rights followed by mineral extraction disguised as recreational or agricultural development. Marlene's case had become a template for identifying and stopping a pattern of exploitation that had been operating in shadows for over a decade. Two families in Wyoming had contacted Patricia directly after seeing news coverage of the Barker Ridge case. Their stories echoed Marlene's in ways that made the pattern undeniable. A ranch family pressured to sell grazing land that turned out to sit above lithium deposits. A widow offered pennies for forest acreage that concealed cobalt veins identified by satellite surveys she'd never been told about. In each case, the same structure appeared. Shell companies, misleading cover developments, legal pressure designed to exhaust resources and break resistance. The Attorney General's investigation had expanded to include federal agencies. The FBI was examining the international networks that had funded Summit Ridge and its sister companies. Congressional hearings were being discussed, the kind that generated headlines and subpoenas, and the particular discomfort of powerful people being asked questions under oath. "You started something," Patricia said. "This isn't just about your mountain anymore. Other families are coming forward. Other communities are asking questions about developments that don't quite add up. You showed them it was possible to fight and win. I didn't do it alone. Nobody does anything alone. But somebody has to go first. That was you." After the call, Marlene sat in the empty lodge listening to the building settle around her, wood adjusting to cold, the fireplace clicking as embers cooled, the particular music of a space that had held warmth and was releasing it slowly back to the mountain. She thought about the woman who'd stood in Gerald Pratchett's office holding a deed to worthlessness, feeling the weight of her father's final dismissal settle onto shoulders already bowed by poverty and divorce and the accumulated erosion of being told, in 1,000 different ways, that she wasn't enough. That woman had been right to be afraid. The odds against her had been real, the opponents powerful, the resources non-existent. Everything about her situation had argued for surrender, for accepting Mitchell's $5,000, for signing away the mountain and returning to the slow diminishment that poverty prescribed. But she hadn't surrendered. And the reason was simpler than strategy or courage or any of the words that people use to describe what happened when ordinary people did extraordinary things. The reason was that she'd had two daughters who needed a different story, who needed to see their mother stand up instead of step aside, who needed to know that the narrative of insufficiency that had been written for Marlene, for Walter, for generations of people who'd been told their hillsides were worthless and their ambitions were foolish, was not the only narrative available. You could write your own. It was harder. It required help from people like Patricia and Dr. Reeves and June and Gerald Pratchett and every person who'd shown up at the hearing or worked in the mine or served coffee at the lodge. Nobody did it alone. But somebody had to go first. Marlene pulled Walter's letter from her pocket. She'd been carrying it since the day Pratchett had read it aloud, folded into quarters, traveling with her through every discovery and confrontation and late-night calculation of the last 8 months. The paper was soft from handling, the creases worn to the texture of cloth. Make something of nothing. That's what smart people do, isn't it? She read the words one final time. Then she folded the letter smaller, tucked it back into her pocket next to her phone and her car keys, and the small notebook where she kept her daily lists, the ordinary instruments of an ordinary life that had become, through stubbornness and luck and the particular alchemy of being underestimated, something extraordinary. Outside, Barker Ridge rose against a sky full of stars. Snow covered the runs she'd helped design. Light from the mining portal glowed faintly on the eastern face, visible only if you knew where to look. The town of Silver Creek glittered in the valley below, larger now, warmer, alive in ways it hadn't been a year ago. And somewhere beneath 140 acres of Montana mountainside, platinum and palladium and tungsten and rare earth elements waited in darkness, patient and ancient, the bones of the earth offering their wealth to whoever was willing to fight for the right to receive it. Marlene Sutter, 48 years old, standing on a mountain she'd inherited for free and defended against forces that should have been overwhelming, looked up at the stars and let herself feel something she'd almost forgotten existed. Not hope. She'd moved past hope into something sturdier. Faith, maybe. Not the religious kind, but the practical kind. Faith that the next morning would bring new problems she was equipped to solve. Faith that her daughters would grow into women who knew their own worth because they'd watched their mother discover hers. Faith that the story wasn't over, that it would never be over, that every ending was really just a view from a higher elevation that revealed more landscape to explore. The wind picked up, carrying cold from the peaks, and the smell of pine, and the distant sound of the creek that gave Silver Creek its name. Marlene pulled her coat tighter and started down the path toward the house where her daughters waited. Behind her, the mountain held its ground the way mountains always held their ground, patient and permanent and full of secrets that revealed themselves only to those who refused to stop looking. Some hillsides aren't worthless. Some fathers aren't cruel. Some inheritances aren't insults. And some women, given nothing but a piece of paper and a challenge disguised as contempt, will build something that outlasts the doubt of everyone who told them they couldn't. Marlene Sutter was that kind of woman. Always had been. Just took the world a while to notice. And the mountain had known all along. The next morning, Marlene woke to sunlight streaming through curtains she'd sewn herself, in a house she'd chosen for its view rather than its price, in a town that had become home in ways she hadn't known she needed. She made coffee on a stove with 4 working burners and stood at the kitchen window watching Barker Ridge catch the morning light. Lily was already outside, crouched beside a rock formation in the backyard, examining something with the magnifying glass she carried the way other teenagers carried phones. Hannah's power tools hummed from the workshop, the sound of creation replacing the sound of destruction that had defined too many mornings in their previous life. Marlene sipped her coffee and let herself feel the full weight of gratitude. Not for the money, though the money mattered. Not for the vindication, though the vindication had been necessary. But for this quiet morning, this ordinary moment, this life built from the wreckage of the one before it, assembled piece by 3 women who'd been told they weren't enough and had decided, together, that the people doing the telling were wrong. Walter Calloway's letter sat in the drawer beside Kevin's apology and Mitchell's first attempt at reconciliation. 3 documents from 3 men who'd failed her in different ways and found, too late, different languages for regret. She didn't need to read them anymore. Their words had done their work. What mattered now was the story she was writing herself. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.